we take turns here, and he speaks, then you speak, then Guntram speaks, and then Vesa speaks. Yeah, and we come here so that everybody sees you. If that's okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So we may begin the third session of our workshop. My task here is just to introduce the title, which is European Macroeconomic Governance and Climate Policy. And the moderator is Alessandro Merli. Alessandro is now an associate fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe, which is based in Bologna. And he was formerly the correspondent of the Italian Il Sole 24 Ore for some time from Brussels and from Frankfurt and then from London also. So Alessandro, the floor is yours to organize the session as you want, and I wish everybody a good session. Thank you.
Thank you, Riccardo. Does this work? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Riccardo. Thank you also for inviting me to what promises to be a very stimulating discussion. And unfortunately, I had to miss your sessions this morning, which I'm told were very, very interesting, but I'm sure I can get hold of a recording somewhere. This afternoon, we have a succession of 4 speakers, which I would strongly urge to be moderate, as I'm the moderator. I try to moderate people and stay within 15 minutes each maximum in their presentations, and then so that we'll have some interaction between them and them and the rest of the audience. The first of our speakers is Thomas Kozluk. He's with the OECD. He's an advisor to the chief economist and has worked on green growth and green issues for a long time. And he'll talk about climate, energy, and the macroeconomy. And I'll give Thomas the floor. I think there is a presentation that's, here we go.
All right.
Thomas.
Sorry. Hello, everybody. Does it work? Yes, okay, thanks. I mean, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this exciting event. It's been a very, very interesting session in the morning, so the stakes are high, and I'm very, very happy to be part of this distinguished panel. I think, well, one of the main points I'm going to try to make today is something that Riccardo opened the workshop with in some way. It's basically is that climate change and climate policy have basically become a macro and structural challenge, a macro and structural problem. And basically, climate policies are at the very heart of mainstream policies right now, and they cannot be seen in isolation from fiscal or from structural policies. So I couldn't agree more with that statement, even if there's still quite a lot of, in practice, separation between climate policies and structural policies. So in the recent years, I mean, I guess this is no surprise to you, in the recent years we have seen basically significant progress on climate-related commitments. For instance, the Paris Agreement, which with the global, effectively global net zero goals in the 21st century. Around COP26, we've seen a significant number of countries committing to net zero emission targets in 2050 or 2060. These don't really add up to the Paris Agreement goal yet, but there's been significant progress. It's fair to say there's been significant progress on commitments, and probably fair to say significantly less progress on actual policies. So if you look at the left-hand side graph here, it's basically stolen from the IEA, or based on IEA data. I mean, if you take policies, this is prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but on the policies that were announced and or already implemented, we would basically be stabilizing emissions, while we were aiming to be reducing them quite rapidly by 2030 and onwards. So there's clearly a big gap between where we are going, or we seem to be going, and where we want to go. And I guess that could be for two reasons. Either we're not really serious about where we want to go, or that it's actually quite difficult. And I tend to believe it's actually the second statement. So while we're all bought on the long-term benefits of mitigating climate change, I think it's largely the short-term and medium-term costs that actually, and both actual and perceived, that actually prevent policymakers from taking more rapid and more ambitious actions. And it's quite clear that some firms, some workers, some households will be losing out because of the climate transition. And policymakers need to face that issue, to address that issue. And how they address it will actually be important for how much growth we can see in the future. I mean, the right-hand side graph is completely fictitious numbers, but basically it's a choice that we're making by the policies we're implementing. We're choosing the growth path of the future. So this balance of costs and benefits will matter. It's been, I think, the person that has been most outspoken about these recently was Jean-Pierre Ferry, but there's many other mentions of this. And I think on the cost side, we see significant potential macro costs, including those due to writing off capital that is otherwise productive, so the premature obsolescence of capital stock, writing off stranded assets like coal underground, for instance, that is an asset and that you think you could use, but you cannot anymore. Investing in assets that, or in capital that would otherwise be unproductive. I think a good example is probably if you think about carbon capture and storage, which in principle is on top of of a coal-fired power plant that you have, but if it not for the climate, it doesn't bring actual benefits per se. So it's more of a cost. Things like destruction of jobs, but also on the non-growth costs, things like the costs for public spending related to all these, or the potential inequality effects, which we discussed earlier today. There's obviously the other side of the coin. There's benefits. There's benefits. Obviously, the ones I think that drive the whole climate debate. Those are the medium-term risks of losses at the global level that we hope to be fixing with addressing climate change. There's obviously some potential gains from technological advancement that may be done through directed technological change. I mean, the proponents of the Porter hypothesis would argue that this will bring, for some of them at least, that this would bring additional productivity gains. We can probably discuss about that. Then the sheer potential Keynesian effects of some of the public spending, if there's additional public spending. There's jobs destroyed, but there's jobs created. What matters is the balance between these costs. And I would tend to claim that a lot of the determinants of this balance will be basically the ability of smoothly reallocating labor and capital from uses that, let's say, used to be economically viable to the uses that will be economically viable. The smoother we can reallocate, the less frictions there are, the higher the future growth path. On the other hand, if the more frictions, especially policy-induced frictions that policy can address, the less better ideas will be rewarded and the less growth we'll have in the future. So I wanted to basically talk about two things in this context. One is evidence from a book that was published last year, which kind of summarizes 10 years of work on the effects of climate policies on firms and industries, and a bit on the role of policies in all this. So the effects in the book, maybe a bit of an introduction. 10 years ago, we basically created an index that was attempting to very crudely summarize the stringency of environmental policies across countries, mainly focusing on climate and air pollution policies. But all the results that we have in this book is basically, they have all been either cross-validated or rerun in the main specifications with the use of energy policies as a also crude proxy for environmental policy stringency, and they hold. So that's kind of perhaps something to keep in mind in today's situation where energy policies are high, energy prices are high, sorry. And the main findings, I think, of all this work is that the effects tended to be small on aggregate. So for the average firm or the average industry, they were not, I mean, they were small compared to the other determinants of what is going on. I mean, this two slides basically look a bit at the pollution hypothesis work. Yes, there were losses in pollution-intensive industries in terms of exports, but they were offset by, on the economy level, they were largely offset by gains in some other industries, so kind of like a comparative advantage story. And they were much smaller than some of the losses due to other determinants of competitiveness of countries over the, I think, 15 years that the data spanned. Similar things for firms on outward investment. So basically there is some evidence of the pollution hypothesis, but I think the more important or the more interesting finding, maybe not coming as a surprise, was basically that there are actually large differences across firms within the same industry. I think that's the right-hand side where we looked at the changes in productivity growth, and that these large differences were actually not only across the line of divide by high pollution intensity, low pollution intensity, but primarily around the line of divide of highly productive firms versus less productive firms. So the firms that were already close to the global productivity frontier in the sense of being highly productive, being leaders in productivity, actually, at least we found, tended to gain from increased environmental policy stringency compared to their competitors, while firms that were struggling already, they had a harder time, at least in terms of productivity growth. And I think that's something to bear in mind when we talk about winners and losers, that the effects are really heterogeneous. And this is, I'll skip this slide, but this is basically where policy comes in, and where the reallocation comes in, I think, especially. So if we're able to smoothly reallocate labor and capital from either from loser firms to winner firms, growth will be higher for the more effective dynamic allocation. We'll be rewarding innovation, we'll be rewarding entrepreneurship. But also if the market, I mean we in the sense, not we, but the market, if the markets also can make losers or can force these so-called losers to better allocate resources themselves through market pressures, and therefore become, let's say, winners of this is also something to consider. And this is basically something that, I mean, if we can't do that, then the cost will be higher, there'll be scars, there'll be hysteresis, and there'll be possible backlash to environmental policies. And that, I think, so fundamentally, reallocation is not something that environmental policies will be addressing themselves. They may be hindering it or facilitating it, but this is something that is a job for structural policies. And just to maybe one quick example of what we observed happen after the global financial crisis, may be relevant for coming out of COVID, maybe not, we will see. But basically we looked at so-called zombie firms. So these are firms that, for various reasons, are struggling in the market, so they don't make profits, or they make very low profits, they struggle to invest, struggle to innovate, but they stay around, they don't exit the market. They, as we'd say, they would hoard up resources from firms that need those resources to grow, both labor and capital. But they themselves, as mentioned, they don't have the resources to invest, innovate, to create jobs, and therefore an increase in zombie firms can be prohibitive to transition to green growth. And that's basically what we saw after the global financial crisis. We saw a particular increase in the share of zombie firms, the share of capital in zombie firms in pollution-intensive industries. So the industries that we would have hoped would transform the most to achieve a greener or a more climate-friendly environment. So, in COVID, we saw basically reallocation in many countries frozen for 1 to 2 years. We'll see whether, we'll see something similar with that. I think it's a bit too early to tell, but it is a danger, especially with the support given to firms, that this reallocation mechanism, I mean, I'm not, that support was necessary, basically. We froze our economies for a reason, but, to what extent the support or the fact that it was maybe in some countries excessive, will be hindering our transition to a more climate-friendly economy is a question that we can ask. So I mean, maybe just on the policy side, I think, coming back to things, so we will need classically defined climate policies to steer that transition. We will need structural policy to facilitate the reallocation, but reallocation, I mean, it's easy to talk about reallocation, but these are actually real jobs, real people, real capital that are affected. So we need also policies to support the type of transition that we will see through skills policies, through social benefit policies, but possibly regional policies. As mentioned, we will need more ambitious climate policies. There was a lot of talk about carbon pricing this morning, or most of this morning. Maybe just one result from a study that we're doing now, or finalizing right now. It's the survey of about 40,000, an online survey of about 40,000 people, which form representative samples of populations of about 20 countries that we're surveying. And carbon pricing is the most unacceptable, politically unacceptable climate policy, it seems, at least out of the sample that we took. And the interesting thing, I think, from this survey, I mean, the levels, you can discuss, but the interesting thing is it's consistently, if you look at the United States, where I guess many of us would expect that, but if you look at Denmark, you get a very similar result. And I think that's something that politicians and policymakers need to be aware of, and I think they are aware of that, partly because, I'm going to skip this, but partly in the context of what we see right now. I mean, people generally don't want higher energy prices, and I think that's one of the big things that was also discussed this morning. This is potentially a problem for transition, for more ambitious carbon policies. What we see these days when governments are scrambling to since autumn last year, to cushion the effects of higher energy prices on households and on firms. And I think what is worrying about the type of support, I mean, we collect data on this support. This is a very crude measure of the distribution of the support because it's actually the number of measures across countries, so it doesn't really give it doesn't compare the money spent or the money forgone, the revenues forgone. Most of the measures, at least by counts, are non-target measures that target prices. So this could be a VAT reduction, this could be an excise tax reduction supporting fossil fuel demand. I mean, I can understand probably why. I mean, these things, many of them were introduced fairly rapidly. I mean, these things may be easier to introduce than some of the target measures. They may be because of the concerns with inflation. I mean, if you lower, even temporarily, VAT, inflation will come out lower for a while and purchasing power will be eroded. But I mean, targeted income support, I think, if this thing lasts, and quite likely it is going to last, I think the targeted income support will be something that will be less costly, first of all, but also potentially less harmful for the climate in the future, less hindering the reallocation. So maybe just to sum up, I think what I wanted to make is basically, one, that macro policies, the climate policies are part of macro and structural policies right now. It's basically intertwined. The success on reallocating resources will determine the success of the climate transition. And that's particularly important because this is a policy-induced transition, not a transition that's going on its own. Yeah? So if we get it wrong, if the costs are too high, there's quite likely going to be backlash, which either will slow down or derail the transition in total. And I think I'll stop there. Yeah?
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you also for keeping to the time. I think we'll have a change of horses here at the podium. Our next speaker, Rick van der Plug. And we've already heard some fairly interesting stuff, which I think will be up for discussion later, including the fact that what many economists think is the most sensible, or one of the most sensible measures, like carbon pricing, is also one of the less politically feasible, or at the moment, one of the less politically palatable for a lot of public opinions. Rick van der Plug heads at the moment, is a research director of the Oxford Centre for the Analysis of Resources Rich Economies. and he has passed as both a parliamentarian, as a deputy in the Dutch parliament, and also as a policymaker in the Dutch government. I'll give him the floor to talk about the fiscal costs of climate policies.
Is it now better? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and we had a lovely lunch, so we were all a bit slower. And there have been already many good presentations, of course, the previous speaker, but also in the previous session at 3 excellent papers. I'm going to give more of an overview, because that's what I was asked to do, and that's what I will do. So this is a topic which I've discussed with the European Fiscal Board. That's a board which discusses fiscal policy, the independent advisory board for the European Union, so we'll discuss that. And because I'm so very old, I realized yesterday, I will take a bit of a bird's eye view from how we used to do it and how we're still doing it, because I think the historical perspective may be interesting. So, but first I want to reiterate the point that it's actually pretty hopeless. I mean, of course, there are encouraging signs, as people have said in the past, but there is almost no carbon pricing. And from this, I will borrow quite unashamedly some slides from William Nordhaus, but just because why not? And but basically, what I want you to walk away with, that despite some initiatives in Europe that has, sorry, yeah, I will do it. Yeah. That despite some initiatives from Europe where we have EU, the ETS, and maybe prices now, and particularly after reform, the Stability Market Reserve, that is now going up to 80 euros per ton of CO2. And despite some efforts in California and China, because of the extreme lack of coverage, the average carbon pricing is very little. And actually, all of coverage pricing is very muddled, it's fragmented and low, and that's in the words of Bill Nordhaus. We used to have these international agreements when I was younger than some of you here. We were all hoping on things like the Kyoto agreements, but the Kyoto agreement was a complete failure. It was meant to be international negotiations, we're all going to go and I'm going to solve it. Well, they lasted maybe a few years, I'll show you a graph, and then it collapsed. And then what Lynn Barrage has already kind of done a wonderful paper to look at it with fresh eyes at this literature on this double externality, that we don't really only want to price the cost of carbon at something like the social cost of carbon, but we also want to subsidize technology. Technology is subject to rights law, and rights law is something that if you double the amount of renewable energy used in place, then you will reduce subsequent costs of renewable energy per unit by 20 to 40%. The same law is called Swanson's law when it's for solar panels. So every doubling of solar panels installed reduces the cost per solar panel of 30%. So like the social cost of carbon, you can have a social benefit of learning, which the expected present discounted value of all future cost reductions from using an extra solar panel today. And Lind has done some work, and I've done some work myself, like the Environment a bit earlier, maybe not as careful as Lind, of course, but the idea is that you want to subsidize both renewable energy, the use of it to get these learning by doing externalities coming in, and secondly, you want to do it also to kick off directed technical change. And the problem is, as Lind has shown, as many other people have also noticed, there's almost none of it. And in actual fact, I'm going to put it a bit stronger than Bill Nordhaus would say it. And I'm particularly using Bill because he's so sensible and he wouldn't overdo it. So I will overdo it now in the spirit of Simone. So for the point of view of argument, in actual fact, rather than pricing carbon, we're doing the opposite. So we have huge subsidies for fossil fuel, huge subsidies for coal. IMF, people like Ian Perry and all that, hardly left-wing zealots, they're more the other way around. They've been arguing that 7% of world GDP is allocated to implicit and explicit subsidies for dirt, for fossil, particularly coal. And that's the problem. The problem is not, of course you should price carbon, but the first no-brainer is, how can we get rid of this addiction to subsidizing coal and all these other dirty things? And it's not just in India, and it's not just in China. It's also in the Netherlands, and it's also in Germany. So there is a big, before we even start thinking about policy, being clever about optimizing, let's just first get rid of the really stupid stuff. So, so now to show you some of these points to illustrate them. Wait a minute, I have to, I certainly see, yeah? I have to go simultaneously, I'm doing it in tandem. So here you see that emissions going up since 1900. This is all Nordhaus, but you can get them yourself as well from the data banks. But basically there's not much of a trend down. And okay, they went down a bit during the pandemic, but they're fully up again. So really, yeah, we talk. It's a lot. Greta Thunberg is a smart girl. She says she comes back from these agreements and says it's all blah blah, and it is all blah blah. And so we talk a lot, but we have not got that much to show it. I think it will come, but it hasn't yet. So this is the challenge. We have to go to the green line, and we have to decarbonize by 2050. So there were these 55 planned, but now we want to go net zero. Yeah, we got to know. Maybe you will follow. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So you have to go to net zero by 2050, and the reason for that, so for those who don't know, it's not just zero emissions, but it means kind of that there will always be steel factories. We will burn coal or something else, and then we have to capture CO2 from the air and put it in the ground somewhere, or put it in buildings. These are all unproven technology. They're fraught with NIMBY politics. It's not going to happen. Yeah, so it's a huge political thing. And so, but these are already written into the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change, that we need them. Otherwise, we can't even get these scenarios there out there. So we talk about it if it's done. We talk about invention of new technologies. So, for example, the hydrogen, which electrolysis, which we learned when we were 15 at school. But it's not yet an industrial scale developed in Europe. So that's the easy one. So I would expect you on a big solar panel farms in Spain, and then you need pipeline to make hydrogen there, and then transport the hydrogen to the rural area or wherever it's necessary. So there's this intermittent, having renewable energy. The big problem, the big elephant in the room with solar and wind energy is that the sun doesn't shine every day and the wind doesn't blow every day or every hour. So we need backup storage. So in some countries, I believe Germany, but Karen can correct me. But for example, some countries are keeping a backup of coal just in case the solar and the wind isn't enough. But anyway, so that's a big challenge. And then this is the type of story. So I'm taking it from Bill because rather than doing the calculation myself. But he comes up with an effective carbon price of $2, $1.7 per ton of CO2. It's hardly to write home about, is it? If you go to your mum and you tell her, look, average carbon price in the world is 1.7, you say, well, boy, it's not good enough, is it? So, and the reason is that, yes, it's true that Sweden is, of course, the best one, and then maybe some other Scandinavian countries. And the ETS, it's now a bit higher, because the ETS is still down at about 25, but it's down at 43, and it's now doubled. But it won't make a big whack. And the reason is that the coverage is fairly low, and therefore it's very good what Simone said, that they're working not only on the price, but also working on the coverage. But I also know that there's a huge amount of political lobbying still going on, which will try to frustrate it or will try to delay it. Then this is a story about the Kyoto Protocol. So you see, it never came off. These are the number of covered countries who were initially about 60% of emissions. America drops out, and then around 2012, all the other countries drop out, and nothing has happened. Good idea, but never happened. So we academics have written thousands of papers on international climate negotiations. People got very expensive professorships from the University of Columbia and other places on something which is like a dead horse. So it's not good. And you see here again, here's the emissions limits. The only time the cap was there, that's the orange line, was for about 5, maximum 10 years, and then it's gone. So it's small potatoes. It's almost nothing. It didn't work. Here you see tipsy-turviness. I could have given you European figures, but I'm being lazy here. You see the huge subsidies for defense, nuclear weapons, security, and the paltry subsidies for advanced energy and renewables. And it's still the other way around. So we don't only have no carbon taxes, very little carbon tax, but they're swamped by carbon subsidies. We don't have renewable energy subsidies. They're so small because they're completely dominated by subsidies for technology. So that has to change, as Lind has already said. So here you see here the carbon prices, here the fossil fuel subsidies, $1 a ton of CO2. So everybody all academics, also in the room here, we write papers on pricing carbon and we send them to journals. But the big issue, how can you get the politics right if you stop subsidizing the bloody stuff in the first place? You see there now new tariffs. So the IMF and others, I think OECD as well, are increasingly in favor of feed-in tariffs. And that's the idea. You try to encourage some yardstick competition, but carbon taxes are so unpopular, so you basically give feed-in tariffs and then you try to work it out. So just saying that there are other instruments which may work, may not work, which people are now beginning to kind of put in place. So this is this Wright's law, this Swanson's law, there's a log scale. So on the horizontal axis you see the cumulative emissions, the cumulative use, cumulative shipments of solar panels, and then the slope of that line shows you by how much the cost drops if you double it. And it's about 20% drop for every doubling of cumulative shipped volume. This learning by doing curve is crying out for subsidies, and they're not there. They are the opposite is that. So you're never going to get this flywheel effects in operation that people. So the idea is you subsidize solar energy, more people will use it gets cheaper and cheaper again. You subsidize electrical vehicles, more demand for electrical vehicles. So then there is more demand for storage. So then that will get cheaper, then the electrical vehicles are cheaper, so you get these positive spirals, these positive strategic complementarities, positive feedback effects. And then you can get flywheel effects coming on, and there's nothing of that going. Actually, the government is trying to do exactly the opposite of that. And then another reason why we have problems, this is before I start on the economics, is that it's enormous amount of policy failure and capture. So Professor Borghese, I'm now calling him professor to pay him the due respect. When I asked him this question about why earmarking, he said, yeah, but I don't trust these bloody politicians. They will walk away with the money, he said over lunch. So now I'm saying it for him, but pretend I said it and that he didn't say it. But that's the real reason for his fear of not earmarking. Because by earmarking, at least you're trying to get rid of this capture. Either people put it straight into the pockets, or they put their political friends there. I even have, as a foreign politician, have friends who became very rich from these renewable energy subsidies. So it is a just fear. Then another fear is that the governments have a tendency to pick, they think that they sit on the chair of the entrepreneur and that they know better than the market. So they pick winners and losers. And then typically they pick the wrong thing. And then by picking the wrong thing, they just put some of the people in there in charge. They make money, they get huge subsidies. It's not a very pretty sight. And I think that was, I hope this is some of the fear that Simone didn't voice, but I think he was thinking of. So here's a slide you can't read because it's in Dutch. But what I want to say is if I then go to my Minister of Finance, I did it both in the Netherlands and the UK, and I did it in Morocco. Don't ask me why. And then I asked him, ask your Minister of Finance the following question, or maybe if you're a journalist. This is my girlfriend, who is also a financial journalist, 20 years. And then I said, well, I didn't realize you worked on green, so I thought we may as well talk about work. You never talk with your wife or girlfriend about it. So I asked Marleen, he said, go and ask the Minister of Finance how much it cost per policy measure to have a reduction in CO2 emissions by 1 ton. And then look at electrical car subsidies, look at stuff for installation of housing, look in the mobility or on the built environment, electricity, the industry and agriculture. And there are huge variations. So the best one is, of course, subsidies for Tesla cars. They're like kind of a couple of €1,000 per ton of CO2. And they don't even hit the poor people. They help the rich people. So you think, why are we doing that? Well, that's but the point is, from an economic point of view, you think it's efficient if the cost of reducing CO2 with what measure or which sectors, they should be equalized. But then it's efficient. Just like in healthcare, you have this thing called quality adjusted life years. So you want the different operations in hospitals to yield the same number of quality adjusted life years per dollar or per euro. You want the same, it's not like that at all. If this table is aggregated, if I disaggregate it, you get difference of 200 or 300 times per different things. And people guard them, ministers don't want to give them, even ministers have to really press their civil servants to release that information. But that's the big shame. There's a huge amount of inefficiency ready to be picked up. Like if you were Chicago, I see banknotes lying on the ground to be picked up. Why are they not doing it? So let me now come to some of the theory. So when I started in the 80s, late 80s, we wrote all these things called on double dividends. So then people, and you still see it. You see many NGOs arguing for double dividends. So say, well, let's kill two birds with one stone. The two problem is full employment and green policies. So they say, well, tax carbon and use the revenue to reduce taxes on labor. Tax on labor very high, and then you get more jobs and a cleaner environment. And so that's wrong. That's completely wrong. In actual fact, you may get more cleaner environment, but actually make it at a little bit less economic activity. So there was a huge literature, starting with names like Lance Bovenberg and myself, but later on people like Larry Golder did some stuff on that and people like that. And now you see younger people, a younger generation of very brilliant people like Lind, who just gave her a paper, who has a nice paper in the American Economic Review on it, which does exactly that. So what you then find is that there's something called the marginal cost of public funds. So you know, if you don't know what it is, it's if you say, look, this is a hospital, it costs 100 million euros. Then the public finance guy says, no, that's not true, because to pay that 100 million euros, I have to collect some taxes. But by collecting taxes, I have to raise taxes and I make people lazy. It's inefficient, it's costly. So then we have this measure called the cost of funds, and in actual fact, it's maybe 1.4. So if it's 100 million, it's actually 140 million, because the dead weight cost of taxation may be 40 million. And then the interesting thing is that under certain circumstances, if you're taxing carbon, the cost of funds actually goes down. So not going to the technicalities, but this is a policy session. The economists used to say, they were always the best, well, you say tax carbon, either it works, and then it's very good, because then people go out of the car and go ride a bicycle and everything becomes green. But then you don't have any money. You don't get any income, because the green taxes don't generate in money, but at least it's green. I said, but if the electricity substitution are very small, everybody stays in the car, well, then from Ramsey's point of view, it's an excellent base to tax. So he says, from a robustness argument point of view, the economists would say, and I used to say when I was a young man, younger than Simone or Niko, maybe we say, look, you do it anyway. Either it works, or if it doesn't work, it's a cheap way of financing hospitals and schools. And that robustness argument is still true. And that's what's now returning with free papers. And I'll discuss that now. The climate policies are associated, what I'm going to say, with non-negligible fiscal costs. So let's look at four scenarios: a first best, second best without lump sum taxes, and then with the labor income tax fixed, and then another one where you keep the capital income tax rate fixed. So the insights from Lynn's American Economic Review article, and so she reconsiders this double dividend literature in a dynamic macro public finance context. She says that there are substantial welfare gains from carbon taxation, and more than 33% once account is taken of fiscal impacts. So the largest effects occur when labor income taxes are fixed between business as usual and optimal, and the capital income tax varies. So then she has a scenario where there could be a welfare gain compared with business as usual of $7.1 trillion. That's not something you leave on the table. And what you find in her paper, that second best carbon pricing is lower than first best carbon prices. So in the late 80s, we show that the cost of carbon, the Pigouvian tax, has to be divided by the marginal cost of public funds in an optimum. So if the cost of funds is higher than 1, say 1.4, you actually lower the whole carbon tax. And that's what these papers find in the dynamic context. They find that numerically. So, and what she also shows that if you don't mitigate climate change, it's quite interesting, if you're not doing your job properly and you let global warming go on relentlessly, then the people will do more adaptation spending to compensate. And therefore you need higher income taxes to do the adaptation, so to build the dikes, to build the water defenses, and then the taxes will go up, and then the marginal cost of public funds will go up as well. And that's bad for left-wing people, because it's more expensive to have hospitals or schools. So 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 this is a way of looking at it. Now what's the problem with I'll go back to the previous one. Just don't leave. Well, you can do. You don't have this slide. There are two other papers. There's a paper by Steffi Fried, also a young lady, like Lyd Barrett, extremely good. They're both the top of the fields of macro public finance and applications. She makes it a bit more exciting in a sense that she is a bit later, 2 years later, so she adds overlapping generations. So there's all these different generations, your age, Simone's age, Niko's age, and then maybe my age, even right at the other end. And some of them work and some of them are retired, and then you can look at how carbon taxes affects all the different generations. So one paper by Kodlikov tries to ask the question, can we do a carbon tax reform and rebate in such a way that all the generations get better off? So that is like what we economists call Pareto optimum. But Steffi goes a bit different. She takes a particular tax function, it's called the Heathcote tax functions, and she finds that the optimal way, so now we have a model with heterogeneous agents. So the model, the households differ by their age, by their vintage, old and young households, and she finds that the most efficient form of rebating carbon taxes is to increase the progressivity of the income tax rather than using lump sums. Then I want to point your attention to one more paper. That paper is really just being finished at the moment. It's by also a very young, bright, extremely young, bright scholar. Yeah, thank you. By Thomas Duen. And he linked up with a macro public finance guy, Pedroni, and a public finance guy called Hummel. And they did the first paper, which does an heterogeneous agent models, which is now so popular in macroeconomics. And then they looked at climate. And so it doesn't sound very impressive. It's actually quite impressive if you see it, because they have the whole income distribution, the whole wealth distribution. So they model all the firms and they model all the households in a country, and then they measure like a log normal income distribution for the income inequality, and they measure maybe something more Pareto-like something more a bit more skew on the top part of the income distribution. And then they look what kind of rebate can we do, what kind of optimal carbon taxes can we do in such a context. Has not been done. It's completely different from that early literature. It's already much more advanced than Lynn's work and Steffi's work, but this is where it's going to. But they also find that the second best carbon, so the first best, if you can give every individual in the world individual lump sum taxes, that's not allowed. That is not politically possible. Margaret Thatcher tried even a poll tax on her own, and that was her Waterloo. She failed. She got kicked out because of that. So that's not going to happen. So you're not going to have individualized lump sum taxes. So you have to divide the tax system. And then they find that you don't have enough instruments, and therefore this is maybe the optimal carbon tax, and the second optimal carbon tax is about 60% of that, much lower. So you need judicious recycling. So I did some work for Germany, and of course I should have asked more Karen and her colleagues after I saw your thing, but we did our best with Armin Rezai and actually, funny enough, a Mexican guy, Miguel. And we looked at political support. So we looked at different ways of recycling carbon taxes, how it would change the number of people that improve. So we looked at equivalent variations. Those of you who don't know, that's like what's the effect on their welfare of individuals? Which percentage of people in the population gets better off, and which people get worse off? So what we find in the political support thing there is you see there the orange line, and then on the horizontal axis you see that the more of it you recycle as a lump sum, then you have less money left to reduce the income taxes, so that's why the income tax schedule goes down. But you see that there's an optimal amount of the maximum political support. So I'm not doing the maximum social welfare, I'm just being like a crafty politician. How can I get it across the line in Parliament? I want majority. So then I find somewhere in the middle. So if I do about half I refund as transfers, and half the money of the carbon tax revenue I transfer as income taxes, then it's good. If you do it all as transfers, that's very inefficient, and it's counterproductive because people become lazy. So you need to use some of it to reduce the labor income tax rates, but then people work harder and it's more efficient. And so you want to do in practice always do a bit of a mixture. So that's that point. So I've already mentioned the Kodlikoff point, so that you can win-win situations, that it's actually possible to generate transfers that not only every generation gets better off, but every country gets better off. This is an impossible exercise in terms of computational challenges, but it's an important direction. So let's look at that. So then I want to talk a little bit about, there are two problems with politicians, which we don't model. The first problem is that politicians prefer the carrot to the stick. Politicians don't like taxing. They like to be popular. They like to open the newspapers. Hey, Van der Ploeg has given a subsidy. When I announced, look, I'm in favor of carbon taxes or taxing cars, I opened up, there was a deaf face of me, there was blood coming out of my eyes, and this guy, he's taking to steal your car away. So if you tax, you'll be killed. That's why, there's a reason why politicians don't do it. So they try to do it using too much subsidies for renewable energies rather than doing carbon taxes, which of course is highly inefficient, but it's understandable that they do it. The second problem with politicians, and I know because I've been one, is that they have a tendency to procrastinate. So when I asked my son to clean up his room when he was still living with me 20 years ago, he said, yeah, Dad, yes, Dad, and I asked tomorrow, no, still is the next week, yeah, I'll do it next week, I'll do it next month, but then 3 months later, he still hasn't cleaned his room. And politicians are like that as well. If it's something, they try to postpone it. Now, in public finance, there's a topic called behavioral public finance, which we don't see enough of in the environmental literature, where they try to take account of these behavioral distortions. And then what you then see is that you see that the optimal, second best optimal, taking account of these behavioral distortions, is to have much lower carbon taxes, much higher subsidies, and then we should really supply the politicians with the efficiency costs of doing that. You will still be able to get to a kind of a green transition, but it'll be much more expensive than it could have been. So another reason is that there's the fear of yellow vests. So the reason why people, it's similar in the way that they don't want to, they have protests. Look at Macron. He tried to, and he didn't think about rebating. He just said, we're going to tax carbon, no rebating, and there was a huge amount of that. So this is the behavioral start. And I'm going to finish with one more topic, which I don't give you on the slide. Now I will stop there. It's that we have a problem in almost all of our economic papers on this, that there are actually, I'm beginning to think more and more that there are multiple equilibrium. Now that sounds a bit techy, but I really think that if you become green, and then if I'm still throwing things on the ground, I'm still going on using a diesel car, and I see you all, then there's a positive social peer effect of me becoming greener. There's a lot of empirical evidence now that that occurs. Secondly, if I see you using a heat pump in your house, and it's possible that, and I might do a heat pump as well. So there are social spillover effects, technological and they will lead to social and technological tipping points, where you move from a bad equilibrium with high emissions to a good equilibrium with low emissions. So almost all of economics have this problem that we are obsessed with marginal incremental policies. And that's what we get, and then we do the optimal around a wrong equilibrium of highest emissions. Wouldn't it be nice if we had some policy, let's call them radical climate policies, that we could, the whole economy, put it up to a low emission, to the other equilibrium, and that's more important than the precise optimum in a local bad optimum. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming years. So this is my take on what we might do to improve. There's a lot of excellent stuff, particularly by young people, which I'm a big fan of. I mentioned Steffi Fried and Lynn Barrage and people like Thomas Douan. And I think we're going to get an explosion of this more realistic stuff of doing public finance. We need to take account of psychological aberrations, social and technological spillover effects, and this whole idea of big push to get from a bad to a good equilibrium. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. I liked your approach to Nordhaus and everything else, which reminded me of what the current editor of The Economist once told me, that she was taught that when you write an editorial, you should simplify and exaggerate. So I think it's a good lesson also for academics putting things in conferences, because you need to attract people's attention. and without losing the substance of what you want to say. We're now going remote to Guntram Wolf. I think Guntram will share his own slides. I think he's the director of Bruegel and formerly was at the EU Commission and Bundesbank, among other roles. But for now, he's the director of Bruegel, and I'll give him the floor. I don't know, Guntram, are you sharing the slides or?
Yes.
Yes. So I'll give you the floor.
Yes. So can you hear me well?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I wanted to talk indeed about, in a sense, where Rick stopped. So about the investment needs and some concrete policy discussions that are ongoing to achieve those investment needs. And so let me share my screen, and you tell me if it works.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So I think the context that I want to discuss is, of course, that and this is, I mean, by the way, so let me go back one slide. This is from a paper I presented to EU finance ministers back in September, but then I decided to add a little bit of additional evidence from another paper of mine in which we discuss in particular the decoupling challenge between economic growth and emissions that the world and even Europe has so far not successfully solved. And for both, investments will be quite crucial. And the question is, of course, how do we get these investments going? What is the role of the public sector and what is the role of the private sector? So this is the broad story I want to talk about. And so I think the context is that, at least last year there was still a pretty good recovery ongoing. And in this recovery phase, fiscal consolidations eventually will happen. And the one key issue is that in past consolidation episodes, so fiscal consolidation episodes, public investments tend to be cut. There's many reasons for that. There's very important political economy reasons. I mean, Rick talked about how politicians like to subsidize. Well, they like to cut public investment because it's less painful to cut public investment than to cut other spendings, be that on pensions or social security or other current expenditures. So this is a big issue in a phase in which the declared European climate goals are about actually increasing overall investment, but also public investment into climate goods. And we come out with some estimates how big the public investment need is relative to the private investment need, which we can discuss in further detail later on. And I will show you some measures of how to get to that number. So there's a big question here. How do we ensure in our fiscal framework, in the consolidation context, that Europe is going into after the recovery, during the recovery from the COVID recession? How do we ensure that public investment as well as private investments are actually happening? But before I sort of focus on this investment need, I did want to remind you about the challenge that we are facing, and so this here is the global emissions. I think you just saw this chart already, but I think what is quite interesting in this chart is that COVID did make a difference, but not a big difference in this 1 year. In 2020, and it's of course by now already on the course upward. So despite all the COPs and the international agreements that we've had, global emissions continue to rise. And the key issue here is that the speed of decarbonization is insufficient, and it is not changing fast in any meaningful way. And just to understand this chart, so this chart gives you the emissions per unit of GDP, so kilogram per dollar in purchasing power parity, so kilograms of CO2 per unit of GDP, essentially. And when you look at that chart, you see it is sort of declining. And if you take the numbers from 1960 to 2016, it's sort of declining at 1.4% per year. So every year we need less emissions to produce 1 unit of GDP. However, global GDP growth is higher than the reduction in emissions per unit of GDP, meaning overall global emissions continue to actually rise. So this is what I would call the decoupling challenge. If we want to continue growing, so if we want to keep real GDP growth more or less where it is, the decoupling has to accelerate massively, and the decline in emissions per unit of GDP have to be much bigger than they have been in the past. And I do want to give you a sense of the magnitude of the challenge by showing you some sort of very simple simulations based on the so-called KAA Identity. And I think when you see those numbers, you will see that a massive and unprecedented effort is ahead of us if we want to achieve the declared global climate goals, in particular, of course, the necessary reductions to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius or even the 2 degrees Celsius. I mean, it's going to be extremely difficult unless really something massive happens. I want to show you some of those numbers and then talk about the investments. So just to explain to you very quickly what is this KAA identity. I mean, it really is an identity that allows us to break down emissions into various subcomponents. And you see here, it really is an identity, and you can sort of conceptualize and think about global emissions as the product of population growth, GDP per capita growth, energy per GDP use, and emissions per energy use. So this is an identity. And what we see is that and basically there is now a discussion, let's say there's a broader discussion ongoing, both an academic discussion, but also I would say a societal discussion, where there is essentially one camp, and I over-characterize here, make it extreme for the editorial here. So there's a sort of one camp that says, look, I mean, the only way we're gonna make it is by really degrowing. So we have to stop consuming. We have to all eat less, consume less. That's the only way we are going to bring down emissions convincingly. The most prominent proponent of that view is perhaps Greta Thunberg, who basically is arguing for a radical degrowth agenda. So meaning essentially, let's bring down GDP per capita, and perhaps, I mean, that you can debate, let's limit population growth. So this is the one side. And then there is the more institutional side, where institutions such as the OECD, but also the European Commission, openly talk about green growth, right? And green growth meaning, well, we really have to work on this last bit of the equation, the emissions per unit of energy, and perhaps the energy use of GDP, right? So those two, let's work on those two. So just to give us a sense of what that challenge actually means, we did look at the numbers and do a very simple forward-looking scenario. And I really just want to show you the world numbers here. So CO2 emissions have been growing by roughly 2% in these last 20 years. per year, right? Population is 1.2, real GDP per capita is 2.6, and the energy use of GDP has been falling. And it's been falling also because of sectoral shifts in our economies away from very industrial heavy economies towards more service oriented economies. I mean, that's one of the factors explaining the reduction in energy use per unit of GDP. The result has been this insufficient decoupling of CO2 emissions from GDP growth, so it's way too slow. Now then, basically we want to ask, well, what would it take to achieve the net zero by 2050? And the net zero by 2050, assuming that population growth is in line with what our population projections give us. And there's not so much you can do about population growth if you take a perspective of the next 20 years or 30 years or so. So these numbers are actually known. I think we take them from the OECD. And we take also the OECD projections for the next 30 years of real GDP per capita growth. So we take those as given. So we basically say, let's assume that we don't follow the degrowth agenda, right? So we are really sort of wanting to operate on the green agenda. And we are also saying, well, let's assume that the gradual decoupling of the energy intensity of GDP continues as before. So we basically keep those first three parts of the KAA Identity in line with, either as they were in the last 20 years or in line with what the OECD projections currently give us on population and GDP growth. What would it take to reach the net zero in 2050? And well, what it takes is a massive annual decoupling of emissions per unit of GDP. So really, this is an unprecedented challenge. We need to produce energy every year. We need to, for 1 unit of energy, we need to sort of every year need 8.2% less emissions than we currently do. So a massive decarbonization of our energy production process is needed if the world wants to achieve the net zero that is needed. Now, there's lots of assumptions and simplifying issues here, and I don't have time to discuss them in detail. I do want to point out that this looks dramatic here for the world. In Europe, it looks already a little bit better because Europe has already started to really decarbonize the energy production process. And if you take more recent episodes, it looks even more feasible. And the good thing, why does it look more feasible? And why is there some hope for optimism? And this is, I think, this chart here. This chart shows that by now some renewable energy sources have actually become price competitive. So if you take, and Rick, you talked about the subsidization. So the problem is, of course, that a lot of gas and coal is still being subsidized, while actually some wind and solar is still relatively penalized. So I mean, one of the striking numbers we looked at in this paper is we show that the taxation of gas is lower than the taxation of solar energy. So this is, I mean, in the EU on average. So there's sort of crazy stuff like this, and this really needs to be addressed. But if you take a look at the unsubsidized prices of energy, it's already the case that it's actually cheaper to produce with wind and solar than to produce with gas and coal. So there is already a shift here happening. Nevertheless, I mean, the energy system is still extremely dependent on fossil fuels, as we are now also experiencing in the conflict with Russia. And so a lot has to happen to really change the energy system. And so what kind of investment efforts are we talking about? Well, the International Energy Agency talks about investment needs of $5 trillion per year compared to the current $2 trillion that is being spent on investments in I mean, this is essentially transport and energy system, right? So this is a huge increase, and if you look at the European numbers, you also come up with pretty high numbers. So this is from the Commission, and the Commission basically says that for the next 10 years we have to move from essentially this number here, which is sort of 700 to more than 1,000 billion euros per year, and these are 2015 prices. So let's say an increase of 360 billion, right? So this is what the Commission talks about. Now what is and you know, I don't know if it's 360 or 450 or 290. I mean, these are, I'm just noting that the IEA and the Commission numbers in terms of percent of GDP, they come to very close numbers. So this is roughly an increase of 2% of GDP in investments, yeah, per year. So 2% of GDP per year more investment than currently. Now, a big question is how much of that needs to be public and how much of that needs to be private. And I can share a secret here when you discuss this with the political system, and I can tell you also when you discuss it in the ECOFIN system. This is what they discuss. I mean, they really hate the idea, and especially the more countries fear sort of social protest and yellow vests and the like, the more they will want this public share to be high, because basically the political system perceives that public investment is sort of politically cost free in that sense, and therefore they want the public sector to pay the bill, and the private sector should not be touched. In particular, don't touch households, etc., because otherwise they'll go protest on the street. Now, so what we do here is very simple. We looked at the 2019 national energy and climate plans, which countries submit to the European institutions, and basically just checked how much is the public share currently, right? So how much is the public sector actually paying of the total investments in the energy and transport system? And this is self-reporting of the countries. And what we find is, on average, currently it's 28%. So the political economy reality that exists, and you know, we can deplore the political system and say they do all the wrong things, but let's just say this is where we live, right? So this, let's take that for granted. Well, if that is the case, we need 28%. So let's say a quarter of the investment has to be done by the public sector. Now comes the problem. The problem is that in fiscal consolidation periods, public investments, so a quarter of the 2%, so let's say 0.5% of GDP increase. This is the problem. Public investment in the EU declined massively in the last fiscal consolidation period. And so there's a question here: what do you do? What do you do? How do you actually increase public investment in the climate infrastructure, in the energy infrastructure, at a time where fiscal consolidation is going to happen? So I talked about this. So this is just to give you the sense, the electricity is taxed more than gas. So, but anyway, this was just a side to the show. So here we come to the fiscal rules, and you know, the paper. I don't know. I think I'm probably already over time, but the paper.
Close.
I have a few more minutes. Sorry.
A couple of minutes.
a few more minutes. Okay, so let me try to sort of be quick here. I mean, so what we looked at is we basically looked at the fiscal rules as they exist, assuming, and that was pre-Ukraine war, pre-war in Ukraine. So sort of assuming that the current fiscal rules would be reinstated as of next year. And I mean, this is probably going to be delayed by 1 year. And we also assume that the 1/20th rule, so for the fiscal wonks here, the 1/20th rule would not be applied because basically it wasn't applied and it's unachievable. And the third thing that we look at, and which I think is quite important, is basically we look at the effect of next generation EU funding. So there is a significant EU fiscal resources that are being paid out to member states as grants, and a significant part of that is for green investments. And the beauty of these grants is not only that they are sort of cash in your pocket, but also that they don't count. These grants don't count towards your deficit and debt numbers under the EU fiscal rules, because this is EU deficits and debts. And even though the taxpayer in the end is the European taxpayer, it's not clear who is going to be paid back, and therefore it's not sort of allocated to the national fiscal system. So in that sense, this is really EU debt separate outside of the national fiscal rules, and that eases the adjustment path actually quite substantially for the main recipient countries in the next 2 years. However, afterwards, this actually aggravates because then it's sort of going in the other direction, aggravates the challenge. So basically, in the main recipient countries of Next Generation EU, the fiscal consolidation squeeze on these public investments will get significant after 24 in particular, while for the other countries, it's going to start basically now as fiscal consolidation kicks in. And the numbers are in the paper, and you can sort of look at these numbers in some detail. But I don't think I have time now for that. So what can be done about this? Just to sort of conclude and wrap it up, I think there's basically three issues proposed. One is a general relaxation of EU fiscal rules. Well, the problem with that is that if you do that, you still don't really create an incentive for these green investments. You just create an incentive for general fiscal laxitude, and some of that might mean that you spend more on green. But at the end of the day, if you're worried about fiscal sustainability, then this is, of course, the worst option. The second that is discussed and that we sort of pushed in this paper is, well, why don't we do some form of a green golden rule? Meaning well-defined green public investments that actually reduce emissions, and as Rick was proposing and is accelerating according to Swanson's law, the decarbonization process and make decarbonization cheaper. I mean, those are exempted, right? And so we allow the public sector to continue doing that outside of the fiscal rules. And the third is some sort of a centralized EU capacity to fund green investment, and that I mean basically would be, let's continue Next Generation EU for longer. And there's some beauty to this, but I think the case for that is actually not so strong, because why should the EU be the primary institution subsidizing green investments in different EU countries? I mean, if anything, we need subsidization of green investments in the least developed countries or in the emerging economies, so that these countries can develop. So let's just talk about one last slide about sort of the key policy trade-offs when we talk about the green golden rule. Well, no, this is the wrong slide. So I think the key, well, the key issue that really I want to push, however, is that unfortunately there is a significant difference between green public investments and general public investments. General public investments, for general public investments, there's a fairly well-established literature that shows that these general public investments tend to have positive growth effects. So economic growth is actually not suffering, but actually benefiting from public investments. And as a result, of course, the tax basis on which you repay your debt or you service your debt tends to increase, which makes it actually financially not very risky. So the public sector investing into a new highway between two cities tends to increase GDP, and therefore this can fund ultimately that bring the tax revenues to actually service that debt. So for green investments, the problem is the growth effects are not so clear, right? And so if we replace an existing gas station with a green electricity charging station, well, why would GDP? I mean, there might be a short-term demand effect, but why would GDP permanently be better? I mean, the cars, it's still basically just you're charging infrastructure for cars, right? So at the end of the day, the growth effect might be quite limited, and so countries where there are serious sustainability, fiscal sustainability concerns, of course, do need to worry about the green golden rule. And it's exactly those countries where probably EU funding is then can be seen as one option. And in a sense, if you look at Next Generation EU, it is already doing that to some extent. But I think that's where the main policy trade-off is. The poorest and the fiscally most vulnerable countries in Europe will face many challenges on their sustainabilities, challenges also related to climate change, to climate adaptation investments, but also challenges to actually fund their necessary green investments. And that's, I think, where where sort of the policy discussion needs to focus on. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Guntram. I hope you can stay for the second round, but you've given us an excellent justification for your early departure. So if you can't, your excuse. I would like to call on Vesa Virihala, and I don't even pretend to know how to spell to pronounce your name, from the University of Helsinki. Some of the fiscal issues that were raised by Guntram will be picked up by Vesa again. Vesa is at the University of Helsinki, previously worked for the Finnish government and the EU Commission. The title of his talk is Economic Policy Responsibility in the New Normal, and then unabashedly he adds that his will be a northern perspective. Vesa.
Is this one? Yes. It's functioning now? Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this distinguished group of people here, coming from being a civil servant and the policy advisor rather than academic researcher. As said, what I would like to discuss here is what are the roles of member states and the EU level in fiscal policy, and particularly in relation to the needs to invest for green growth, as has been discussed in this seminar earlier. And my starting point is very simple. It is sort of public economics description of the objectives of policy in general and fiscal policy in particular, which basically says that there are three functions there: stabilization, growth, or longer-term economic objectives and redistribution. And if you think of the EU as in Maastricht, then there was no stabilization functions at the central level at all. There was not really a fiscal function for growth at the central level either, with the exception of cohesion policy to some extent. And there was very little redistribution among the member states or between the member states, again, with the exception of the cohesion policy and agricultural policy. Now, this changed a little bit in the euro crisis when a new mechanisms were created partially within the EU budget, the EFSM, and then outside the budget, but nevertheless they were EU level or euro area level mechanisms to do stabilization in the extreme case of threatening financial instability. However, they were not redistributive in the sense that they would have allocated money to certain other countries from others, where they were loans with strict conditionality. So this was the thing, and nothing much changed with regard to growth or redistribution. Then we had COVID-19 crisis, and now things changed more fundamentally in the sense that we had at least two functions, sort of centralized functions with fiscal policy objectives. One was this employment policy thing, I think it is called, it was loan instrument to the member states as EFSM had been previously. And then we of course had the new generation EU, which combines now a number of things. It's transfers, it has redistribution in that sense, it's financed by debt, which is a completely new phenomenon. And although originally I think it was at least marketed as a sort of stabilization instrument, it hasn't turned out to be that, because the disbursement of the funds takes place at a time when most of the member states already are well sort of recovering or have indeed recovered from the slump. So it's much more a growth instrument or instrument to deal with climate change or green transition and digital transition. So this is the thing where we are. We have basically, without changing the treaties, we have entered a new era in the sense that we have some functions, fiscal functions at the EU level. They are, of course, ad hoc and they are temporary. But at the same time, this development has reignited discussion about a permanent fiscal the function of fiscal capacity at the EU level. However, was this right? This hasn't not very much has happened in the last 2 years since the introduction of the new generation EU. One might argue that perhaps the economic arguments or economics arguments for that are not quite as strong as sometimes made, and I tend to agree that there is an element of truth in that, but I don't think that is the main thing. The main thing why we haven't gone further with regard to centralized fiscal capacity or centralized fiscal policy making in general is that there is this political economy argument in let us call north of Europe, saying that we fear that there will be one-directional and oftentimes unintended redistributional effects of any mechanisms, centralized fiscal capacity, whatever you, however you design its precise parameters. Nevertheless, in the practice, it will be something that the Germans, I think, call transfer union. And this is the reason why we haven't gone further. Now, since the NGEU was introduced, a number of things have happened which actually seem to suggest that there are stronger reasons than before for joint policy action and with some fiscal elements included. I won't go through these different things which have happened. I think they are almost self-evident, to save some time. But the implications of these new facts, I think, are that more investments are needed for green transition, as discussed several times during today's seminar. There's also a greater need of EU-level public goods. I mean, we were discussing about R&D, and particularly the need to develop green technologies, and R&D certainly is an area where you have public good features of any spending at the EU level. You may think about cyber health, border security, defense. Those have been mentioned here even today. And I would also argue that there's more demand for insurance against large shocks, not all shocks, but large shocks in the EU. I can't discuss all of these, but I will focus on the first aspect of it. And basically the question I'm asking here is this one. Given that there is this great need for investment in EU for green transition, digital transition, and which means perhaps a 20% increase in the investment ratio as a whole for the public sector and private sector as a whole, and as Guntram just told us, that might translate into something like 0.5 to 1 percentage point increase in the public investment in relation to GDP. So if there is this sort of need, of course efficiency is very important, and it means that we have to spend the money where the bang for the buck is greatest. And this actually may not be the same place where the resources are. So it may actually imply some redistribution in order to achieve this. And now the political economic question I want to ask here is this in grave conflict with the existing views, particularly in the north of Europe, that is against any sort of redistribution in addition to what we have in place currently? And my sort of tentative answer or proposition I would like to make, not necessarily under certain conditions. And the conditions are, I think, at least 4 things can be mentioned here. The additional EU resources need to be such that one can convincingly argue that they really create or finance EU-level public goods, that there is a good case to be made for them to be creating EU-level public goods. Second, that the targeting of any additional redistribution among the member states is improved so as it really serves the purpose we are trying to achieve, and is associated with appropriate conditionality. Thirdly, the contribution of the private sector needs to be maximized in order to keep the public funding pressure as small as possible. And finally, you need to have improvement in the quality of public finances so as to get really those things achieved what we want to achieve with the funds. And what I try to do in my few minutes here is to try to argue that actually many of these things can be achieved with reasonable effort. And my starting point here is basically a very well-known thing, that it is the new member states in East and Central Europe that have the highest emission per GDP intensities. And I think it's quite clear that these are the countries where you get most bang for the buck, where cutting emissions is cheapest. And so if anywhere the need is great to do something about the emissions. At the same time, we know they are poor countries compared to others, and we know also, and that you can see on the right-hand panel, they tend to invest or use a lot of public expenditure for investment already. The investment ratios are high, public investment ratios are high in these countries. So I think there's a prima facie case for further redistribution in favor of these countries to achieve the objectives of green transition. Then what about the older member states, some of which are also relatively intensive in emissions, and I have circled in red those countries. They unfortunately also happen to have low spending on investment in the public sectors. And now I would like to sort of demonstrate simply that these can do a number of things, or a number of things can be done in these countries. Unfortunately, some of these countries are sort of squeezed by the existing size of fiscal space. They don't have enough fiscal space. On the left-hand panel, you have countries which are highly indebted at the same time when they also are low in investment share in overall spending, investment and a low investment relative to GDP. And some of these countries, like Belgium and to some extent Italy, also tend to have high tax rates, which means that they cannot raise taxes too much. The previous presentation, Rick was talking about the cost of public finances, which I think is a more important issue for these countries of high taxation than other countries. But there are some fortunate things that we can observe. For all these countries, developed old member states who invest little or invest little in public capital, the private sectors are well in surplus, in financial surplus. So it would seem to be the case that in these particular countries which don't have that much public investment, there are private sectors which would be capable of doing a lot, either directly if incentivized correctly or efficiently, or by grabbing some funds from them by reforms in the tax benefit systems, tax subsidy systems. Second point is that actually the structure of public spending in those countries which invest little in public capital seems to be tilted towards current consumption and transfers. The share of spending on investment in overall public spending is low, precisely in the same countries where the overall capital spending of the public sector in relation to GDP is low. And I did a simple calculation here where I raised artificial technically the share of public investment in total expenditure in all countries which had low shares to the median level of EU 15 or the median level of EU 27, and calculated how much larger the public investment to GDP ratios would be. And the numbers are astonishingly high. They are between 1 and 2 percentage points for all those low investment countries. And they are high enough so that even if no other country would do anything, and we would not change at all the overall spending level, public spending level, the EU average spending on public investment would increase by 0.5 to 1 percentage points of GDP. Actually, that coincides with the range given by Guntram a few minutes ago for the need for EU-level public investment for green transition. One may, of course, argue, as has been discussed here earlier today, that any change in the structural public spending would be very difficult from the point of view of social cohesion, and so that certainly is the case. But I don't think it is necessarily an overwhelming obstacle. If you look at the existing spending structures, particularly with regard to the share of investment in overall spending and the degree to which each member state equalizes income through redistribution, it happens to be the case that those countries which have low investment shares in public spending are also typically countries which do least income equalization. So there is no trade-off in that sense, in my view. So it should be doable. And on top of everything else, as we have discussed here too earlier, it happens to be the case that those, not only the new member states, but also the old member states with low public investment shares have now or are now receiving quite a bit of money from the RRF NG-EU. So I think I come quite naturally to these sort of conclusions. If there is to be further redistribution to facilitate green transition, that should go mainly to the new member states, poor new member states, which have low GDP per capita, and many of which, by the way, happen to be threatened by the Russian aggressive behavior right currently and probably going forward many years to come. So therefore, I think if you look at these transfers or redistribution effects from the point of view of the northern European countries, I think there will be high acceptability for this sort of transfers. At the same time, we have to take into account that Ukraine will need a lot of transfers from the European Union, much bigger transfers than Poland has been receiving. Ukraine is, in terms of population, a bit bigger than Poland. The GDP per capita in purchasing power parities is 1/3 of the Polish level, and my understanding is that by now the capital destroyed has been of the order of 500 to 600 billion euros, and it's increasing by day. So I think there's a clear case that if we want to be a democratic Europe, we have to spend quite a lot of money on Ukraine, which means that that money won't be available for anybody else. So what does it leave for the old member states which have been investing little in public capital? I think they need to rely more on private sector investment. They need to change the structure of public spending towards investment from current spending, and then we would need to take a look at the RRF to see whether or not the funds that have been committed so far serve the purpose as good as possible. And very finally, I'm squeezed on time. Let me say I have listed a couple of things that relate to the ongoing discussion about reforming the EU economic governance and the policy framework. And I think, even though I'm not a supporter of golden rule for the very reasons which have been mentioned, I think there needs to be some preferential treatment of some narrowly defined green, digital, and R&D investments in the fiscal rules, and then these rules also have to put a lot of pressure on, in general, improving the quality of public finances. Secondly, we need to improve fasten the introduction of a true banking union and capital markets union to facilitate a better, more and better allocation of public funding for all kinds of investments. And at the same time, that would serve the purpose of doing better smoothing of business cycles across the member states within the private sector. Third, I think we need somewhat more, I don't know, not 50% more, but somewhat more bigger EU budget. And given the time pressure, I would even consider, I don't know if that is politically feasible, perhaps here are people who are more competent to say something about that. Could we perhaps open up the multi-annual financial framework to discuss, to change the structure of spending and increase it somewhat in order to be able to provide those EU-level public goods that we have discussed about today? And very finally, I haven't really touched upon the stabilization aspect. As I said, the key criticism of the North with regard to fiscal capacity and be it NGEU and earlier also with regard to the financial stability mechanisms was that it might lead to redistribution which is unintended and detrimental for incentives. And if we want to use common funds for stabilization purposes, I think they would need to be directed towards large shocks, to preventing large shocks having major impacts. Cross errors has been mentioned here earlier today, that concept. I think the best use is there not in everyday cyclical, every annual cyclical stabilization. And then if this is the sort of starting point, then a natural question comes to my mind. Can't we do something more with the existing ESM, given that it is precisely intended to handle large shocks which have detrimental effects for the, in this case, the euro area as a whole, its financial stability? Could we not re-examine its mandate, resources, and conditionality to make it capable of doing something more than just financial stability stuff? That's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vesa, for your very interesting contribution. I'm not sure if Guntram Wolf is still with us. Maybe not. No. Okay. I would ask, maybe in the same order, the three speakers if they want to add something or comment on the other speakers. I just want something that I want to leave on the table, especially after the last two contributions, the fact that contribution of the private sector needs to be maximized, but of course we worry a lot about the fiscal, but there seems to be relatively little talk about that, especially as the money is there, as Agustin Carstens, the head of the BIS says, and there's been some pretty hyperbolic numbers bandied about, like 70 trillion, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and stuff like that. But I mean, it may not come to that, but there's no question that, especially through financial markets, if we look at ESG funds and green bonds and all that, there's certainly an appetite for this sort of investment. So these funds need to be mobilized, but we would need to look at a lot of conditions for mobilizing them, like the taxonomy, the infamous taxonomy, the data, the accounting rules. I mean, these all may be the topic for another conference, but as you mentioned, the question of the maximizing the private sector contribution, I think this is very important to be kept in mind. Otherwise, we go around in circle about the fiscal and the limitation of the fiscal, whereas there are other resources out there that could be exploited at the right or with the right conditions. I don't know if maybe Thomas first and then Rick have something that they want to add or comment on the other speakers' contributions, and then of course we open it up if people from the audience also want to ask questions to the speakers.
Thanks a lot. I had one very specific question to Rick, maybe. I mean, you showed the Swanson law for, I think it was for photovoltaics, and I think there's quite a few people arguing that was basically because of China's entry into the business, right? So this was not really necessarily innovation, it was just bringing down costs and kind of a one-off thing that was there. I was wondering whether do you have any reflections on that? Can we expect this to continue, or could it be? Yes, I know, not the China, but this, let's say, learning by doing, I'm a big fan and believer of, but I think there's quite a lot of people that argue that this is exaggerated for the photovoltaic cost reductions. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing, on the taxonomy or ESG or whatever, I had a slide which I didn't show, but I think it relates to the golden rule for green investment or all these other discussions. I mean, at least so far, the experiences with ESG were very poor in the sense of providing direction for what is green, what is not. I mean, for the same companies, I think this is the slide I was showing, for the same companies where you have the standard credit ratings which are aligned among the different providers, the ESG ones are just completely different, yeah, which is obviously a problem, yeah. Then there's the whole issue of the taxonomy, which, even if the EU adopts an ideal taxonomy, it's not clear that the other countries would sign up to that, yeah. So anyway, that's, any reflections on ESG, I think, more generally. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for the many contributions in this session. I'd like to reiterate again what I said about these unusual policies. So yes, I do think there's still a lot of unexploited scale effects or unexploited learning by doing effects, a lot of not enough redirecting technical change that needs to be done. And that's also been corroborated by the numbers that Lind put on her sheets. But that's something different. And then the China thing, for example, I remember, but again, Karen knows more about it, but of course many countries have been subsidizing solar energy at a large scale, or excess subsidies for renewable energies rather than pricing carbon. But as a result, the idea was, or the hope, there was an infant industry, and that Germany or Europe would have a whole solar panel industry. But the truth of the matter, of course, is that China walked away with that. I don't think that's bad for the green transition, but that may be a consequence. I personally think, so what we did with vaccines, we asked 5 or 6 parties and created a race and said, look, try to get these vaccines to kind of stop COVID. And we just betted on a number of horses, 5 horses, and then we chucked a lot of money at it, and we were prepared to make failures. And it was a kind of an interesting compromise. Masakati would probably like that, between government and private enterprise. And maybe we should do something like the same with that renewable energy, because I think on the technology front, politicians, most of them are really betting on technology to come along, but it's a game of chicken. They're waiting, but it's not happen unless you kind of put these flywheel effects in operation. So if only we could, all these governments could show the same energy together with the Bill Gateses and those type of people and the research labs to really get the same kind of multiple research efforts where you bet on 5 or 10 horses, including fusion energy, including hydrogen energy, and then let them win with each other, and then start using it, and then the cost will be driven down. But I don't see any of that action. I see this wonderful plan of the EU, and they have nothing on a kind of a real R&D breakthrough plan or something like that. And I think that's really what's needed, also given the political distortions we see. So that's why I like to talk more about the scientists. They talk about tipping points like the melting of the green sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, or the Antarctic ice sheet, or the melting of the tundra, and that will lead to irreversible shifts in the climate system. What we should be talking about on a much shorter timescales is irreversible shifts in the political, technological, and institutional systems, so that we really kind of get a radical or get a transformative change. That's really what's required. And we don't get it around with piddling around with little marginal taxes here and there. So really we need to have a vision. That's something. We need to put a dot on the horizon. Okay, we said net zero, but we haven't said how. And then try to have some imaginative actions like we did with the COVID, and the need was really there. Now the need is really there with the green energy. And try to put in there, and then you get these technological tipping points, you get these social tipping points. I'm for sure, I really think if more and more people become green. China had thousands of years of foot binding. So little girls, they had their foot bound, and then they couldn't walk away from their rich husband. And then there was a cruel practice because they became very deformed. And in about 10 years, attitudes changed. And foot binding you don't see anymore. So norms, the evolution people call it punctuated equilibrium, they can suddenly change. We've seen it with attitudes to homosexuality. And England used to be the worst country in the world for attitudes towards homosexuality. And now it's the most liberated, free, and very politically correct, some people would say, but they've changed. And that was in a space where maybe, when I was younger, in the 80s, not nice to be homosexual in Britain. And now it's right up there. But it was, the point is, it's a certainly transformative change, but then when it happens, it goes really quickly. So what kind of policies can lead to these radical, quick changes in the green technology, in social attitudes? Most of all the models that we use have models with exogenous preferences. That's how we've been brought up. But preference of people can be changed, and people are social human beings. And now, thankfully, more and more people are thinking along those ways, and it should also change then the way we think about economic policies and climate policies in particular.
I don't think. No, on. I don't think I have much to really say to your questions about this sort of. How to treat different investments, as I understand what you were aiming at, what to consider sort of preferred public expenditures. Drawing the borderline is always difficult, but I think that we already now have in the Stability and Growth Pact some elements where you take into account investments as a sort of I mean, if you spend more on investment, you are treated more leniently than otherwise in the rules to some extent. I think that can be widened a little bit, but you have to have a judgment. But here we discussed independent fiscal sort of bodies which could make a sort of expert assessment of different sort of statistical treatments. For example, what is classified as green and what is classified as something else. And I would also say that perhaps R&D is something where we have reasonably good grounds to believe that we know what we are talking about. And R&D that basically develops green technologies, I think there is a lot of expertise who can argue that this is real stuff. This can be treated somewhat more favorably than other expenditures. So, but I would take a very narrow view on that and basically say that we have to use the other margins which I tried to mention there, for example, leveraging on the private sector, which is very important.
Pressing questions from the audience. I'm told we should prepare for the next session, so I don't see any hands raised or any rebuttals or... Yeah, again, mentioned the private sector. I think action is needed on several levels. I mean, nobody ever thinks about these plumbing issues, but, you know, accounting rules, for instance, you need to set some sort of accounting standards, global accounting standard for disclosure of sustainability. I was talking to Erkki Liikanen recently at the G20 conference on these issues, and I mean, he's at the forefront of that, but I'm not sure how fast they're moving on that. And, you know, that's just the basic to have any company move on that, is that you need to have clear accounting rules. You know, nobody ever talks about that because it's totally unsexy. I mean, it's totally uninteresting to most people, but then for companies, whenever they have to do something about that, they need clear accounting rules that they're just not there. I happen to be on a board of a smallish bank, but not small, not too small. It's regulated by the ECB, and we get this pressure from supervision to do lending that's more attentive to ESG principles. But then not even the supervisors know what these ESG principles should be. So we're trying to patch up things, and the credit department is looking at things, but, you know, we're not even getting from the banking supervisor. I mean, we're talking about European governors in terms of fiscal and all that, but then you need to go into the nitty-gritty of this, and sometimes it's just not there. Right. So I think we'll move on to the next one. Thank you very much for. 10 minutes.
mi ha mandato un messaggio a me, Mauro Petriccione
Questo va
è
bene.
entrato nella tua riunione.
Sì, benissimo.
Perché nella mia riunione dovrebbe essere...
No,
Non
no.
ce l'ha, vedi che non ce l'ha qui.
No.
Lui ha sbagliato il link.
È lui che sta mandando tutti i link.
Ah,
Hello, Helen, I see you're there. Nice to meet you. Sorry that we're not in person. We're waiting to... There's a problem with the other two participants to your panel, and we're trying to link them in a moment, okay? Well, no, also with the Petriccione, he entered in the wrong meeting for some reason. I'm sorry that you couldn't make it here, Ellen. It would have been nice to meet you in person. I cannot hear. Oh, sorry. Did you unmute?
The travel turns out to be really complicated in all this world we now live in.
It is. It is indeed. Were you able to follow part of the previous sessions?
Yeah, I joined about 11:15 your time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I've seen quite a lot. It's good.
Yes.
I've enjoyed it.
Well, I must say I enjoyed it too so far. So it's been quite interesting. Okay, I have to try to get the other two guys on and understand what was the problem, because lei ha ricevuto il messaggio da Petriccione che è andato dove?
lui per me ha sbagliato il link.
Hello, Mr. Petriccione, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you now. Thank you for being here. The session should begin in 4 minutes. We have a problem with the moderator who is apparently received the wrong link, and so he's connected elsewhere, but we are in touch. So if you can bear a moment, both of you,
No
Helen.
problem.
Sorry. And also the other panelist, Daniel Gross, has not shown up yet. Oh, here he is. Okay, so everybody's on board. Okay. No, except for the moderator, who is Beda. Oh, no, here is Daniel Gross. Hello, Danielle. Can you hear us? Is Beda, did you call Beda?
No, I think he should be getting the email now. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that's a bit stressful.
Is he?
I think he
Okay. Hello, Daniel Gross. This is Riccardo. Can you hear me?
Ciao, yes, sì.
Ciao. Well, I know that your Italian is quite excellent, in fact, but today we're going to be in English. Well, welcome to everybody. We are still a couple of minutes early, and we hope to be able to connect to our moderator, who is not yet connected, but we are on the telephone with him. It's a technical problem, and as soon as he arrives, we will begin the session. Do you want me to call him on the phone? Is he responding? He responded.
He hasn't responded, but I always have...
Excuse me.
You have tried. Maybe he will now.
Il nuovo link è arrivato da Niko, Niko Jaakkola? Okay. Okay, you should be able to connect now. Yes. Okay. Yes, you're coming in. Okay, very good. Okay, so we are able to begin.
Are we, is it time? Almost time.
Yes, it is time. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. We are now ready to begin the fourth session. We are actually in time. This will be on the European political economy of macroeconomic and climate governance. The panel is entirely remote. It will be moderated by Beda Romano, who is now the correspondent of the Il Sole 24 Ore from I have a loss of memory. Brussels or Frankfurt now, Beda? You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Brussels.
Brussels, yes, of course. Sorry about that. Welcome, Beda. And we have the other three participants who are in alphabetical order: Daniel Gross, Mauro Petriccione, and Helen Thompson. Daniel Gross is director of the CPS and is well known as a macroeconomic and policy advisor on issues of European governance. Mauro Petriccione is a Director General for Climate Action at the European Union. And Helen Thompson is a Professor of Political Economy at the University of Cambridge. She's well known for both for her podcast and for her recent book on the subject of European political economy. So I leave the floor to Beda to conduct the debate. And hopefully, maybe later there will be space for questions from the public, which probably we related to what we have been discussing earlier on in the morning and the early afternoon in the previous sessions. So Beda, if you would like to pick up, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rovelli, and welcome to all. I'm glad this panel is entirely online. At least we are on the same level and on the same page. Before giving the floor in alphabetical order, I'd like very quickly to sum up the situation today, seen from Brussels, of course. There is the attempt by the European Union to become the first continent being climate neutral by 2050. So in 30 years' time, In the meantime, the 27 member states have decided some very ambitious targets regarding 2030, and the European Commission has introduced and is introducing legislation, proposals, in actual fact, which are being discussed on a technical level between the member states now, but at some point it will become extremely political. But for the time being, the negotiations among member states is on a technical level. This is the aim, the strategy of the European Union. But a number of factors have to be taken into consideration, and I suppose that the speakers will touch upon them. There is a fiscal constraint, first of all, given the Stability Pact and the rules of the Stability Pact. There is also probably a demographic issue as well that plays in. And in addition to national sensitivities, which have been apparent over the last months on issues surrounding environment, energy, and so forth, there is the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine is a major factor playing into the discussions. Privately, here in Brussels, some diplomats are questioning the strategy and the end goals of the European Union from an environmental point of view. There is, from the Commission, the idea that things have to move in that direction, and in actual fact, because of the war, you need to accelerate. But if you speak to some diplomats in some member states, they have cold feet and they are questioning the realism of the strategy. So we might want to discuss this matter. Is it possible to become climate neutral while there is a war being fought on the European continent? Is environment compatible with war? I think that is the issue at stake. Now, if you don't mind, I will give the floor to the speakers in an alphabetical order. I hope that everybody agrees with this. And so I will give the floor to Daniel Gross, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this nice introduction as well. I will not be able to look at all the elements that you just mentioned. Let me just zero in on something which has come up several times today, namely the investment needs for the green transition. I think we heard from Guntram and some other people how large they will be, what the fiscal implications are. And I wanted to share just basically two thoughts on them. But since it's a number question, I would like to share my screen, if you allow me to, Beda.
Yes, absolutely. Must I?
Let me just try to do so. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, I presume I should go to full screen. So, I think if one thinks about the intersection between macroeconomic management and climate governance, or basically the Green Deal, a key issue is how large are the investment needs? Are we talking about macroeconomically and fiscally decisive numbers or not? And here I must say I have my strong doubts with the official story, which most previous speakers have accepted. And the first doubt arises from the tension, which I already have also heard earlier today, between the techno-optimism, which says, Rick mentioned that and others, cost of photovoltaics goes down very quickly. Wind is not the same speed, but also But at the same time, we heard several times that especially EU institutions officially say there will be very large investment needs, 600 to 800 billion per year. It's a mystery for me why they always insist on these very large numbers. Maybe it shows the importance of the EU, I don't know. But both of these cannot be true at the same time, right? It's quite clear. Now, where does this tension comes from? And I think the key issue here is the confusion between gross and net, so to speak. And that goes also to the heart of what is green investment. It has important implications for NGU and so on. What is a green investment? It should be the additional investment need over and above the one you would have anyway, given the economy. The additional need arising from the need to reduce emissions. So one example would be you have a new photovoltaic or wind power station instead of a gas turbine one, right? But you cannot just say, oh, we have to spend so much on photovoltaics, and that's the cost of green, without taking into account that we spend less on gas turbine ones. Now I take it in that specific area, there might be a case for backup capacity, so there might be less strong. But I think even more important, and you will see that later in the data, it's on transport. Because if you look at it carefully, when you look at what is sold under transport infrastructure, it's not roads and railways. I think nobody would say we have to spend hundreds of billions now on new roads or even new railways in Europe. If you look at the official cost estimates, basically most of that is vehicles. And then I think what the Commission has done and other people have done is just they look at the cost of electric vehicles, multiply that by the number of new cars sold, and that's right, without taking into account that the real opportunity cost is the difference between the cost of an internal combustion car and an electric vehicle. And that makes a very big difference. And I think, as I said, this is a numbers game, so you have to look at what it means. So I'll give you here, this is the official estimate of the Commission. The impact estimate of, Fit for 55, right? And it gives you the spending in the past, in the first column. So investment in the power grid, investment in power plants, investment in boilers and so on. And the one expected for the next decade, 2021, that's the second column. And the third column is a bit further off, so I will ignore it for a while. So basically what it says is that total investment there was over the last years around 56 billion per annum. It should go up to 95. 40 billion per year increase, right? By the way, this stuff is inflation adjusted. 40 billion, right? So that's very far from the hundreds of billions that we have had seen earlier. And part of it is the investment in the power grid, which one understands because the distributed power generation through renewables will require a different grid. But also in power plants, basically being renewables and wind turbines and so on. As I said, the techno-optimists would say that this stuff here should become less expensive over time. But okay, let's take it. So that is for what's called the supply side, so how we produce energy, basically electricity, at zero carbon. And now we come to the real costs, which is the demand side. And that is here I have highlighted in red, I think, transport sector investments. And that you see is, that's a delta, right? We're going from total demand side from 626 to 851. So already in the past, we spent 600, and now we're supposed to spend 850, right? So what is the cost of the green? The delta? Or were we already spending 600 without noticing it on green? Now, how do you get to 500 billion on, or 600 billion on transport sector investments? That's a bit more than we need in new roads and so on, right? It's easy. Let's say annual sales of vehicles in the of cars, just personal cars, is 10 million per year. The cost of an EV of 40 billion. 10 times 40 is 400. So if there are 10 billion EVs being sold in Europe every year, that's a cost, or a green investment cost of 400 billion. We have to keep that in mind. So that is what we are talking about. It should be really, of course, a difference in the cost between EV and an ICU engine. And that is an order of magnitude lower. The cost which is real, the only one, the main item which is real is residential sector investment, isolating homes. That is really an additional investment need. It's not negligible, but we are not talking about 600 or 800 billion. And remember that for the public finance need, it was supposed to be 1/4 of the overall investment need should be public or might be public. Are we talking about 1/4 of 850 or 1/4 of 150? It makes a very big difference. So I really wanted to have people to think about what is green investment and what is the cost, the public sector cost of the green transition, right? And here, as I said, we have to really distinguish between the gross and the net. And the net is an order of magnitude, I would say, lower than the gross. And even on the gross ones, the actual efficiency gains observed so far suggest that the techno-optimists might be right. But then really we should relax. So my conclusion is that the overall investment needs have been vastly overestimated for the green transition, and that the public finance needs in particular have also been vastly overestimated. I'm not talking about overall public finance investment, which is desirable, but I'm talking about the overall public finance that is needed for the green transition. And since that is really a second order of magnitude for me, I think there's little need for special rules for green investment. I have emphasized one point, but I think it is key for the entire discussion, and perhaps I rest my case here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel Gross. I think I will pass on the floor directly to Mauro Petriccione, and I think he will reply to you on the issues you raised. Please, Mr. Petriccione, it's your turn. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Well, whether or not I agree with his conclusion, I'm very grateful to Daniel for making very eloquently one of the points I wanted to make. I entirely agree. People tend to focus on the investment required to affect the change without considering that maintaining the status quo would cost us almost as much. Not quite as much, but almost as much. The effort that we need to make is important. It's not to be underestimated. And while there's a difference between cost and investment, you still have to find the resources for investment. But people tend to think that you compare this new investment with the status quo, which is immutable, perfect, and satisfactory. It's not immutable. Our industrial and power system is aging, and aging fast, and needs replacement anyway. And it's not immutable. And it's prone to disasters. It's not climate resilient, and it's prone to many other things. So the one point I really want to make is, in order to, I'll do another bit of what Daniel did. Let's try and frame the discussion to begin with. I want to focus on the notion of change. I mean, first of all, it is hardly surprising that some people involved consider this change exaggerated, too fast, too uncomfortable. Human beings are inherently resistant to change. You cannot draw conclusions from the fact that some people are resistant to change, that the change is objectively undesirable. You can only get to that conclusion when you have a majority of people in that view, and even then to be discussed. And if you look at the public opinion polls in the member states that are raising doubts at the political level, they paint you a very different picture of what people think about the change. Secondly, if we want to talk about, honestly, about a macroeconomic framework for climate change, we cannot start from the cost of climate policy. We have to start from the cost of climate change. Then we have to compare it with the investment required to do our part in remedying it. And then you have a very different pictures, because the cost of climate change is completely ignored by our macroeconomic framework and by our fiscal framework. Climate risk is not insured. In the best of circumstances, certain climate risks in certain member states are insured to the tune of 35%. In other member states, we're less than 5%. And not all the climate risks are covered. And the insurance industry will tell you that they are not able today to price adequately climate risk. So our number one instrument for socializing the risk of natural disasters, which are increasing in frequency and intensity, is extremely inefficient in this situation. Hardly any member states has a scheme to compensate for losses. And those who do finance it ad hoc out of the national budget. There's no provision for that. Just look at summer last year, and the level of the disaster that we've had, and look at the progression over the past 20 years. The cost of climate change is going to do very serious damage to our finances, to our economy, and we are not equipped for it. So that means that what we face is, first of all, a worsening situation, a worsening economic situation, lack of resilience of our industrial structures, because these disasters also affect economic activity. It's not only wars that affect economic activities. Floods do too. Fires do too. Lack of water for cooling plants does. Lack of water for river transportation in Europe is an issue. So we have that. We have to foresee the cost of adaptation and the cost of coping over the next few decades. And then we have the investment needs for the transformation, faced with the money that we would have to spend to maintain the system as it is, to remedy those disasters, and rebuild infrastructure, rebuild industry, rebuild the urban framework. And I'm not talking about the loss of human life and the loss of health. So there is an issue here in terms of the honesty of the debate on the cost of the transformation. Secondly, when it comes to change, if we look at Europe in isolation, we could argue, but this doesn't mean that Europe spending all this money will stop climate change. Europe is a small part of the whole picture. But Europe is the fundamental part because it is the one place where we are experimenting with affecting the change in a way which is economically sound and continues to maintain a vibrant and competitive economy. What's the counterfactual again? The counterfactual is an economy which is holding out, which is not particularly competitive, which is innovating in most areas less than our competitors. We're still innovating, but we have trouble innovating as fast and as much as our competitors. We have trouble financing our own innovation. The number of startups that have to go to California to be financed and to scale up, as opposed to say in Europe, is frightening. We have an aging structure of our economy that needs modernization on a massive scale. Where is the exception to this bleak picture? Green technologies. So one area where we're still producing more patents in absolute and relative terms than anybody else in the world. We have created the renewable energy industry. And we have created with the serious public support, for instance, through feed-in tariff schemes, etc. So there is also an economic agenda which we could not ignore, even if climate change went out of the picture as a miracle. We need a deep transformation. We need a step up in terms of competitiveness, and we have a competitive advantage in the green sector. When you start combining these two things, the case for transformation is overwhelming. Is it comfortable? No, it isn't. Is it the kind of change that people embrace willingly? No, they don't. Is it the kind of change that can be affected if you set the right incentives and the right regulatory framework? Yes. And then the comparison with the war in Ukraine, that's my last point as an introduction, is, well, would the war in Ukraine have not happened if we hadn't embarked in this transformation? As a matter of fact, I think you can make a very strong argument that if we had done this transformation in the 30 years following the first oil crisis, which was in 1973, Russia would not have the ability to wage war in Ukraine today. How long do we want to wait, and how many other wars or energy crises do we wish to endure before we stop being mad? Because in 1973, we all panicked, we thought it was over, and then we got another crisis in 1979. And we've had regular crises again, and which we have tackled with the ostrich policy of thinking they were blips, rather than structural features of a fossil-based economy. We're not being voluntarist in saying environment comes before everything else. We're saying stopping climate change is essential in the true sense of the word. Our system, our economy, our society cannot cope with climate change. We have to stop it. There are ways to stop it that makes our economy stronger and help us do the transformation that we have to do anyway. The fact that this is becoming even more urgent, the fact that then people say, well, you know, this is too fast, too soon, and we have a problem with the war, and we have a problem with the energy crisis, and gas is expensive, well, let's do it later. I think we spent the last 60 years doing this, and that's what brought us to the situation today. The fact that we have in Europe a massive popular consensus and a strong political consensus across the system is unprecedented. I'm not saying this has become a structural feature of Europe. It may not last. What we are suggesting is that we should profit from this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Petruccione. I will probably have a few questions to ask you later on, but for the time being, if you don't mind, I will let the floor to Mrs. Thompson, and with that we have wrapped up the first part of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bader, and thanks very much for inviting me. I found the panels this morning extremely stimulating. I want to start really by trying directly to answer Bader's provocative question: is environment compatible with war? And I think that it is, and that in some ways the war is a moment of clarity about things that have actually been true for some time. And at the center of that, I would say, is the fact that we can't separate out the issues of the energy transition from the dysfunctionalities of fossil fuel energy driven economies and fossil fuel energy geopolitics at the moment, and the difficulties that they pose to us given the length of time that the energy transition will take place. I think that there's been a tendency, particularly since net zero targets, net zero 2050 became the language in 2019, or started to become the language anyway in 2019, to treat energy and climate as a binary question. In this sense, either we were serious about climate or we were serious about present tense energy, fossil fuel energy dysfunctionalities, and you kind of proved that you were serious about climate by sort of, in my view, burying your head in the sand about fossil fuel energy dysfunctionalities. And I think that what the war has done has shattered that binary and make us see that actually we have to think across the whole energy spectrum at the same time. It's raised the urgency of seeing that, and I think that is a good thing, even though the predicaments that involves confronting are extremely difficult. I think in order to see this, I would go back to 2019 itself and say that from that year we could see really that a fossil fuel energy crisis on its own terms, and I mean by that leaving aside the destructive consequences of burning fossil fuel energy for temperatures, was in shape. And it was in shape because the effects of the shale oil and gas boom out of the United States, in terms of their impact on the world economy, were beginning to wear off. Not completely, but if we take oil for starters, where I think that the effects were clear in 2019, that year, for the first time since the middle of the 2000s, oil consumption outstripped oil production. And we're beginning to see right at the end, just the last month or so before the pandemic, that the shale oil boom perhaps was faltering in the United States. At least the speed of growth had, shall we say, stagnated. And what we've seen since the pandemic, the post-pandemic economic recovery began and sort of stop-started several times last year, is each time the recovery comes, oil prices go up, and they go up to levels that Western politicians find it pretty difficult to tolerate. And we can see that really clearly, I think, in what happened to Biden's administration last year. I would say that Biden was almost like exhibit A of this mentality of, we're serious about climate when we ignore present tense energy oil dysfunctionality. And by last summer, Biden was begging OPEC Plus to produce more oil, and he was leaving, his more radical supporters in the Democratic Party somewhat bewildered by that. If we move to gas, I think what we can see happen last year again, so before we even get to the war, was a big demand shock from China came. So China increased its gas imports by around 20% last year. We saw ferocious competition by the end of the year over liquid natural gas supply between European countries or some European countries anyway, and Asian countries. So the war as an energy shock has come into a situation in which a really severe energy shock, I would say, was already underway. And if we just take a few instances then of how the fossil fuel energy dysfunctionality interacts with the climate side of things, one of the things that we can see happening, and again it was happening last year before we get to the war, but the war was doubled down on it in some sense as a phenomenon, is the way in which, as gas becomes very expensive, that coal consumption rises. And we can't be indifferent to this because, as we know, the carbon effects of coal are rather different than the carbon effects of gas. And I say one moment of clarity, I think, that's come from the war, because I think the war has brought these questions into sharper focus than the energy shock did last autumn, is how do we think about gas? Have we completely abandoned the idea that it's a bridge fuel that helps us move from where we are now to where we want to be? Or do we need to take more seriously again the merits of gas if the consequences in present tense actual situation of being hard line about gas is simply to drive coal consumption up? The next thing I would say in terms of the way in which we now need to think about the interaction is at the macroeconomic level. And obviously the reason for that is because we're back in the world of energy inflation, which was there not only, as we know, in the 1970s when it was extremely well known, but was sort of raising its head as a potential problem, at least in the mid-2000s and in 2011. And in both cases, we know that it causes quite serious difficulties for central banks. And it raises the question of like whether monetary policy can actually be used in the direction of price stability when the cause of the inflationary pressure is energy inflation rather than anything else. Now, I think here partly central banks do understand the limits of what monetary policy is going to be able to do to deal with inflation. And if we go back to 2011, we know that unlike the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, that the European Central Bank did respond to that inflationary pressure coming by oil prices by raising interest rates, and it had pretty disastrous consequences. And I think that means that we're going to be quite wary about treading very far down this road. Again, I'm not saying we won't tread any distance down this road, but I think that there's a political aspect to this too, which is how is this energy inflation perceived? And it's really important that as many people as possible, in a way, understand why fossil fuel energy now is driving energy inflation, because otherwise it's going to be very easy for people who are not on board with the energy transition and not on board with taking climate change as existentially seriously as it needs to be taken, to blame energy inflation on the energy transition. Now, I'm not saying that there's no interaction, and I think there were some issues again where we can see this, I think, in Europe last year, where low wind levels lead to more gas being used in electricity generation. And then when that happens at a time of rising gas prices, there is some kind of link between, there is a indirect link between energy transition and the energy inflation situation. But in some sense, I think it's really important for people, for it to be communicated, the difficulties with carrying on with fossil fuel energy and the supply constraints around it, because the more that is understood, the less the green energy transition will get the blame for energy inflation. And I think that energy inflation is here to stay. The only way in which it's not here to stay is actually if it causes so much demand destruction that it sends economies into recession. So I think that there are various things, just to finish with, that are sort of difficult. I mean, I was going to say something about the whole issue about dealing with the distributional question. I'll just say something very quickly about that. The distributional question, who the losers are. And I think that it's a lot easier to see how fiscal compensation to losers funded by ETS revenues is dealt with than it is to see how the distributional issues that electric vehicles cause is going to be dealt with. Because the losers of energy inflation can in part be subsidized, by fiscal transfers. But it seems to me to be really open to question whether it will be possible to move to mass car ownership where cars are electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engine. And that means that if that is the case, for that not to be a really destabilizing issue in democracies, then there would have to be very considerable subsidies for people to buy electric vehicles. And that seems to me a very different kind of proposition, including fiscally and politically, than the idea of basically subsidizing people's energy bills for the next few years or so. So one just final thing to end with, and this is where again I think that the war has acted as a moment of clarity, is it's very difficult given the timescales involved to see how the energy transition over the short to medium term doesn't involve some reduction in energy consumption. You know, we can't wish away the fact that that at the moment renewables in themselves for electricity generation and electrification in transportation are not going to provide solutions over the next few years. And as part of the transition, I think reduced energy consumption is inevitable. And I think that actually the dysfunctionalities of fossil fuel energy are also going to put pressures on the energy consumption issue. We can see that in a number of middle income countries at the moment, where they've already been down the road of energy rationing, including China, where electricity was concerned last autumn. But what the war, I think, has changed more directly than the pandemic had the possibility to indirectly, was to make it possible politically to discuss reduced energy consumption. You can see that in the statement by the Commission and the International Energy Agency about how it might be possible to have energy sanctions against Russia that go beyond the present sanctions on coal in the fifth package, and you know, the direct statement said that there were these X number of things, 10 I think it was, be corrected if I'm wrong about that, 10 number of things by which energy consumption citizens could act to reduce their energy consumption, including like working by home and driving their car less. And I think that kind of political conversation, that kind of statement would have been politically impossible even 6 months ago. It was not a response that was a sort of, in some sense, it was almost in some sense taboo. I can't think of a better word to describe it than that. Even I would say in what was going on last autumn, the war and raising the stakes so high and people understanding what the human consequences are of way in which we consume energy and the dependence on these extractive supply chains and the geopolitics around that, particularly in relation obviously to Russia's position, but really not only in relation to Russia's position when you think about the regimes that we import oil from in the Middle East, mean that it's possible to talk about actual energy consumption itself and the distribution of energy consumption perhaps in particular. And I think it is, that is part of being serious about the climate crisis, then the war has, in its tragedy, brought a moment of clarity and some possibility for change.
Thank you very much, Alan Thompson. Thanks a lot. I think I'll move on with questions from my side, and I have 3 of them. One for each of you, if you don't mind. The first one would be on the Stability Pact, and I will ask it to Daniel Gross. A second one on the war in Ukraine seen as a constraint regarding investments, and I would ask probably Mr. Petriccioni to answer that one. And then the third question would be regarding nuclear, and I would ask Ellen Thompson to discuss this matter and see which ideas she has on this aspect. Now I'll move to Daniel Gross regarding the Stability Pact. You mentioned at the end of your presentation that budget rules don't need to change. I think you want to elaborate on this aspect. There is a discussion going on in Europe. The budget rules have been suspended a couple of years ago because of the pandemic. At the end of the year, they should the suspension should be abolished, cancelled. But there is a discussion about a prolongation of this suspension, and there is parallel to this a discussion on whether to change the Stability Pact because of different issues. Now, during your presentation, you implied that no specific change of the Stability Pact is needed. Would you elaborate on this?
Thank you. Just to be clear, what I said that the green agenda does not justify any changes to the Stability Pact. In particular, I would not agree with what the green golden rule. I mean, it could be done, but it would be, I think, Guntram already mentioned earlier that green investment doesn't add any GDP, any taxable GDP, right? And also, I repeat, there the concept, what is green investment? The gross or the net is key. And if you, of course, allow for the growth, then you get into very large numbers. If you look at the net, then it becomes quantitatively not very important. So therefore, I would say the green investment needs do not justify any change to the Stability Pact. There might be 10,000 different reasons to change the Stability Pact, which I don't think we want to discuss today. That's a different story.
Okay, so no change because of the green transition. Okay, perfect. The second question would be to Mauro Petriccione. My job today is to be provocative, so don't judge my question deeper than this. I have underlined the issue of green transition linked to the war in Ukraine. The war is not impacting the European Union as such now. There is no war on the common in the EU territory, and the EU is not a co-belligerent or explicit co-belligerent. But it is creating uncertainty for economic actors, for financial markets, for families, companies, and so on. Is it possible to bring about this transition in such an uncertain environment, especially regarding the investment needs that may be lower than expected, according to Daniel Gross, but do exist? Do you see an issue there, a time issue between the need for investment on a long time, on a long period, and a war that is, a constraint, a time constraint also for economic actors?
Thank you. A method premise as well. I do have a tendency to fall into provocations. So don't read too much if you see me getting excited about part of the provocation. Very personal. You can make that case. I don't think factually, quantitatively, you can make it today. You can make the case it could happen. You can make the case that we're going to spend a lot more for our military security than we were doing before. At the same time, you still have to look at the counterfactual. We are going to have, whether we like it or not, to get out of Russian gas and Russian fossil fuels. There's a huge reluctance in our country, huge reluctance in Germany, but we should have no illusions. The Russians have now started using the gas weapon explicitly, and they will not stop. They will not stop until we give up. And if we give up, I think, then all bets are off. We are going to be able to replace that gas with other supplies. We're rather confident that this is possible in the short term. Wait until you see the bill for that. At the end of the day, if you look beyond the next 18 months, economic rationality leads to accelerate the replacement of fossil fuels with other sources than fossil fuels brought from somewhere else at much greater expense. You're going to have a combination of coping with the short term and coping with not disrupting the lives and the economy of Europe with the rational choice of going for replacement. And you're going to have two seemingly contradictory agendas. You're going to have a short term, an 18 months, 24 months agenda, which is replacement, very expensive. Some investment on LNG, which may well result in stranded assets. But you're also going to see, I hope, rationally, a ramping up of investment in faster replacement than with renewable. Just to give you an example, some things can happen very fast. Some estimate, and we are looking into whether those estimates are reliable, that you could increase the output of the current solar park in Europe by 50% simply by replacing the panels with the latest generation. Now, the only limitation to that is how fast you can produce those panels. So we're talking about months here, not years. So there are things that can be done already in the short term. More fundamentally, I think this discussion is fascinating because it's showing how we are trying to cope with a different paradigm. All of a sudden, the war, it has, if not put a stop, made a big dent in a philosophy which we follow for the past 30 years. I spent 30 years doing trade policy. All that mattered was the economy. All that mattered was our economic performance. Growth meant jobs, growth meant prosperity. All of a sudden, something else matters more. Our security is not dependent on how economically performant we are. It is in many ways, because you don't win wars if you don't have a good economy, which is why the Russians are in trouble. But in the immediate term, people are seeing other things in the economy matter to my very existence and to my comfort, to my prosperity, to my prospects. Now, I'm sorry, the moment you shift to that mentality, you complete the shift that we have been doing for the past 10 years on, well, there are other things that matter as well. The environment matters, the way we live matters, the impact of climate change on our health, on our lives, on our prosperity, on our comfort, and on that of our families, our children, matters. And therefore you move from, you invest because it makes sense economically, it's a good deal, to invest because you must. And that completely changes the paradigm. And I think we are seeing a lot of that. Now, I'm an optimist, not only a techno-optimist, as Daniel said, but an optimist generally speaking. You don't do public service for 35 years without being an optimist. But I do think that we are moving in a situation where we will be looking at spending resources because it matters and not only because it's a good deal. Maybe not 100%, but I think it's going to be an important and lasting shift. So yes, I think it is compatible. Also, I want to go back to the point that Helen made when she was talking about the moment of clarity. I think this is another example of that. There's a moment of clarity on where it matters to put our resources as opposed to how to we increase simply our economic welfare, because from that, everything else will flow. Well, not everything flows from economic welfare. The health of our planet does not flow from economic welfare, especially if we have conceived it in a way that's destroying our environment. And our military security does not entirely depend on our economic welfare. The challenge is increasing also because of the distribution effect. because, as always, the increasing prices that we are seeing, it's hitting harvest always the same. But, and this also goes very much to what Helen was saying about the distributional effect, and it's not a response, it's a complement to what she was saying that I very, very largely agree with. The cost of the transformation will fall on society. As Danielle pointed out very clearly, the cost on the public purse is relatively limited. Cost falls when you talk about investment in vehicles is normal people. I'm sorry, the normal people who can afford it have to understand that they've had their life too easy for too long. Our lifestyle has been too cheap for too long. There has to be a serious impact on redistribution, protection of the vulnerable, and those of us who can afford it, and we have to contribute to paying for the transformation. And we need a lifestyle change in terms of energy consumption. We've been seeing this since the end of 2018. Our long-term strategy that backed the proposal to move to climate neutrality in 2050 foresees a reduction of energy consumption between now and 2050 of up to 50%. It's got to be done. It's got to be done now faster. And again, I share Helen's view. The war brings a moment of clarity to that issue too. People see the necessity of doing it, and therefore they see the possibility of doing it. Once you see the possibility, that has implication also for the longer term.
Thank you very much. Before going back to the issue of Stability Pact and the issue of socializing the risks, I would like to ask Ellen Thompson something regarding nuclear. Now, some countries, because of the energy transition, have decided to revamp nuclear power. France is among those. I'm living in a country, Belgium, that has decided a few weeks ago to interrupt the closing of a couple of plants and decided to keep them open. And there is a debate in Germany on this issue, although it appears to be still at the start. How do you see the debate on nuclear? Would you consider nuclear a possible transition source of energy in some sort? Because you made the difference between gas and coal, gas becoming less negative for the environment than coal. Would you make the same argument for nuclear, for example?
Yeah, I think that the nuclear question is both interesting and difficult. I mean, it's interesting if we go back to last autumn again, how during what I would describe as that energy shock, nuclear power returned as a political issue, a contested issue, and a really contested issue in the European Union. You could argue perhaps in terms of the contest between the member states over it, there wasn't really a parallel, I think, in terms of what had gone before. And that raised some interesting questions, I think, about Germany's position on energy questions and whether the European Union could become a place where Germany's internal energy decisions were contested in some sense. Now, I'm not against nuclear power, on principle, and I think that I'm in favor of being realistic about how we deal with short to medium term deep difficulties, and I think that means facing up to the present tense intermittency of solar and wind. I think someone said earlier, there isn't a remedy at the moment to what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And I live in a country where the wind blows a lot more than the sun shines. And this is part of where we are until that there's a technological breakthrough on storage for renewables. So to rule out nuclear, whilst that is still true, seems to me to be foolish, if not, perhaps I would go that far. What makes me nervous is I think we've been here before. If you go back even to the late 1950s, and the European Atomic Energy Community, nuclear power was, in some sense, the great European hope. It was a response to the humiliating exposure of Western Europe's foreign energy predicaments as they were demonstrated in the Suez crisis. And you can find plenty of rhetoric from the time where basically people are saying, including people obviously at the Atomic Energy Community, well, Europe can solve its awful geopolitical dependence on others by nuclear power, because it just doesn't involve the same kind of problems as importing oil from Saudi Arabia or from the Soviet Union, etc. But as we know, the story of nuclear power turned out to be a lot more difficult than that. And I don't just mean because of what happened in Germany as the political reaction against it in the 1970s. I mean the finances of it too. And although France is held up as a country that embraced nuclear power the most, in Britain you quite often hear comparisons being made to Britain's detriment about how much better the French were about this and the British were about this. But it's also true that, as we've seen in the last few months, that France's nuclear industry is in some difficulty. France has had some electricity problems itself because of the functionality of its nuclear power stations. So although that I think nuclear can't be ruled out at all, I'm a bit nervous about some new kind of energy utopianism almost being projected into nuclear, where people just think, okay, if we just embrace nuclear, then we just electrify everything as rapidly as possible, everything will be fine, or at least as fine as it can be in terms of what we're talking about. And that's the point where I become a bit more skeptical again, because nuclear power has already got a history, and it's got its own history of dysfunctionality. It may still be a better short to medium term bet, but I think it needs really careful thinking about, and I think we certainly can't just think that it's a fix.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like now to ask a third round of questions to the three of you. And in this case, I will try and ask you to project yourself in the future, the three of you, on three different issues. The first issue with Daniel Gross would be about the problem of socializing risks. And I think it would be interesting to have his say on how he sees governments socializing risks because of the energy transition. The second question would be to Mauro Petriccione about how he sees the energy market evolving over the years. I do think that in the same way as the pandemic triggered a debate on a health market in the EU, now there is the sense that the EU needs a more integrated energy market. And finally, to Ellen Thompson, I would like to ask probably about how she sees society moving in an environment, where climate transition becomes entrenched and a political objective of everybody. How do you see people changing their own lives from a daily point of view? Now, let's go to Daniel Gross about socializing risks and how you see governments facing this issue and adapting themselves to this problem. Because as I think was said by Mauro Petriccione, climate change is provoking distress, floods, all sorts of natural disasters. It's becoming a cost, and this cost is possibly acceptable for the wealthier, but much less for the poor. How do you see the issue being dealt in the future?
Socializing risks is the basic function of governments. Socializing, of course, individual risks, which average out over society. That the government can do. Socializing or protecting the society against an external risk which hits everybody, that's of course not possible, because the government can only redistribute resources within the country. But I thought what you meant was, to the extent that climate catastrophes have a differential impact on different parts of the population, that should be socialized. But again, that's a natural function of governments. That's why you have progressive taxation, you have unemployment insurance. So I don't see what is so new about that.
Well, on a pan-European level, and in a context in which disasters become more frequent, you might want to decide to deal with it from a pan-European perspective. It was done in part with the changes in the Stability Pact that were introduced by the Juncker Commission in 2015, where they accepted an increase of public money in cases of disaster, of natural disasters.
So there are two things. Just saying we are more flexible in applying the Stability Pact, that does not distribute any resources. It does not socialize any risk. It just allows countries to overshoot their fiscal target, which they do anyway, right? Which the EU has zero enforcement power, but it does not socialize any risk, because just allows countries to do whatever they want with their own money.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's not a socialization of risk.
Well, it is a way of using public money to try and compensate for natural disasters.
Sorry, there's a difference between using EU public money, right? But that's completely different from saying.
Absolutely. You discuss both, either EU or national money. How do you?
For the national money, I think every country should be free to make its own mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And if they think that they have to redistribute much more, well, so be it. I think at this point, all pretense to have the Stability Pact being imposed has been fallen by the wayside, right? Let me just add, which is I think key, which few people want to acknowledge, which is that the capability of the government to socialize risks depends on sound public finances. And the one thing I would say is that what we should have learned over the last years is that large shocks come around more often maybe than we had anticipated. And that increases the case for having your debt level low. Right? Because if you have already a high debt level, then a large shock comes along and you're stuck.
That's an answer.
So I would say in during the not good times, to the not catastrophically bad times, we should strengthen public finances. And if countries don't do it on their own, okay, I think then they should be told that, okay, the next shock comes around, you're on your own if you haven't prepared. Right? We had certain rules, you choose to not to follow them. Okay, it always, it works as long as times are pretty good. But when the next shock comes along, be put on notice that then you cannot claim that at that point you need help because your debt level is already so high. So in that sense, I think the enforcement of the Stability Pact should be much more in the sense that, okay, very high debt levels diminish your ability to react to large shocks. Know that when the large shock comes around, your claim to have help from the EU will be much diminished.
Okay, and just for a quick follow-up question. Did you agree with the flexibility clause that was introduced by the Juncker Commission in 2015 regarding the possibility for countries to overshoot the budget levels because of natural disasters?
Yeah, I think this seems to be, I mean, the natural disaster, the fiscal impact of natural disaster that we have seen so far in the EU is of a second order.
Okay, perfect. Wanted to be sure about that. Now, moving to Mauro Petriccione, how do you think that the war, as we've discussed it up to now, will trigger a more integrated energy market? How do you see the energy market moving over the next years, given the impact that the war is having in the discussion regarding energy dependency and so forth?
It's an extremely difficult question to answer. To be very honest, just to start with that, I don't have a real answer to that. I can give you some elements of how we see things at this stage and what the possible evolutions are, but I don't think anybody who is being half honest can give a real answer to that question right now. But there are some parameters. I mean, first of all, let's rev back a second to before the start of the war. As Helen reminded us, we were already in the middle of an energy crisis, which was not caused by our energy policies, but which had an amplifying effect on our energy and climate policies, because the spike of gas prices originated in China, it spread, and it was bringing back coal big way, emissions big way, high ETS prices, and what threatened to be a vicious circle. Now, everybody acted shocked. How come we have this high prices all of a sudden? Until people started digging out the unheard Cassandras or before the pandemic, who had been warning that gas prices had been abnormally low for a long time. Now, this is a time for sobriety. I don't know how long it's going to last. I mean, human beings have an uncanny ability to ignore what they don't like, and unless it's in front of their nose. And right now, what we don't like is in front of our nose. We can't ignore it. One thing, an element of consensus among my colleagues, among the people we interact with, is that the low prices aren't going to come back. Not for a long time, if ever. Never, if we can effect the transformation. The way that, nobody thinks that they will be as high as they, when nobody thought before the war that they would stay as high as they are for very long, defined very long. Is it next winter or the winter after? Now all bets are off. Now, I mean, in the uncertainty about how long is this war going to last, in the objective fact that while we are all operating under the assumption that the war will not spread and operating to ensure it doesn't, I think it would be a little bit unrealistic to imagine that it cannot spread. So in this situation, nobody really knows how long we're going to have high energy prices. The other fundamental element is that we still do not think that the energy market rules in Europe need a radical change now. And even if somebody would disagree with that, an energy crisis and the war on top of it aren't the right time to make radical reform to energy market structures. My third point is that what is gaining ground is that the purity of energy market rules isn't a wise policy either at this stage. So the real question on the table is what kind of temporary measures could or should be taken on the understanding that that is not a permanent feature of the system, that we will have to look at whether the system requires a permanent reform or a long-term reform, let's be more precise, a long-term reform of market rules. The whole debate about price caps is part of this third strand. With are we capping electricity prices? Are we capping energy prices? Are we capping gas prices? Are we doing it for economic reasons? Are we doing it for social reasons? Are we doing it for security reasons? With the idea of a tariff on imports of Russian gas, or to arrange with that. So there are these three strands which interact. Complete uncertainty about the trends in energy over the short to medium term, not knowing where the war will go. There's plenty of people who are exercising themselves in making predictions. But the fact that you have so many people with so many different predictions gives already, it's a demonstration of the level of uncertainty. And some of these predictions may well be the right ones. I just don't know which ones. The second element is very great reluctance from the Commission to undertake a radical reform. And the report from Nasser has strengthened that view at this stage, which doesn't mean that we will not, it doesn't mean we will not have a hard look at the long-term rule, not in the middle of a war. And then a short-term issue, which I think will come to a head in the European Council over the next month or so. If it's not debated at the end of May, it will be debated at the end of June. I mean, this is going to be on the leaders' agenda sooner rather than later. In what terms? Without revealing too many secrets, I honestly don't know, because there is, again, a tension between prudence and a sense of urgency. And so far, I have to say, contrary to the usual Cassandras, we're not doing too badly. We were criticized for being too slow and too prudent in the pandemic. If you compare the performance of Europe in handling the pandemic with all mistakes we've made, and without find any excuse for them and apologizing for them, but you compare our performance with that of other countries, compare with the vaunted performance of China. I think our economy has restarted. We haven't had massive unemployment. We are back to worrying about labor shortages. What is our problem? Supply chains in China, because China is in lockdown again. So this tension is there. It's difficult and problematic, but not unhealthy. That we are keeping this tension between sense of urgency and trying to see where we're going before we take action with long-term consequences. I know this is not an answer, but I mean that's what we are. If I had an answer for everything, I wouldn't be here. I would have been betting on the stock market, and I would probably be on holiday somewhere.
Thank you very much. Ellen Thompson, last question from my side would be a more sociological question on how you see society living in a low carbon economy, an economy and a society facing heads-on the transition, the climate transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different things that I observe, at least, and in a way, the war, features, or the response to the war features both of them. On the one hand, I think that there is still, I should say, a certain dissonance around energy, of like not quite understanding how systemically important it is, despite the fact that energy is so much more pervasive in people's everyday conversation, both because of worries about energy, inflation, energy bills, and because the war has just brought some brutal truths about where energy comes from and how dependent we are in Europe on energy from places where we would rather not be dependent, have come to the surface. And I think on the one hand, you can say, I know this slightly goes against what I said earlier, but I'm going to come back to it, of, well, it's a moment of clarity. The existential stakes have been made like very visible, but I still get the sense at times when I listen to people or read people advocating whole-scale European energy sanctions against Russia rapidly, they don't really know what they're talking about in terms of the systemic consequences of what they are proposing that happens. And that leads me to think that actually there's still a pretty significant social and psychological adjustment to what the demands of living in a low carbon society actually will be. On the other hand, I am struck very strongly by the way that the events of the last few years, particularly obviously the pandemic, but I wouldn't say only the pandemic, have just changed the social psychological space around politics. And I think that there is just a sense, and I think I feel it critically, in the UK, that nothing ever is really going to be the same again. And that, I mean, in the case of the United Kingdom, it's the last, we're on year 6 in this sense of shocks, like starting with the referendum for many people. So, we had 3.5 years of politics on a pretty much daily basis entirely being saturated by questions of our identity. I mean, because obviously Brexit was about lots of things, but that's what a lot of it felt like, living through it, like for 3.5 years with it being unresolved. And obviously those political debates rocked the union of the United Kingdom to its core. Just as before we were having the general election, after 3.5 years, finally settled it, we had very serious flooding. There was a sense of respite after the general election, Brexit, the actual departure happened, and then pretty much immediately the pandemic happened. And each time the pandemic looks like it was coming to an end, of new variant, particularly obviously Omicron, was, which was particularly lethal, in Britain, came along. That starts to look a bit better, and then the war comes along. And I don't think that there's any sense around that actually there is a status quo, an old world, in which we can retreat into, and it's not coming back. I think I just get a sense that most people I encounter in daily life, that's how they think and feel about this. And in that space, that means that politics has to be different, and it will be different. And to go back to Maro's point is that the politicians might not have known for a long time how to do politics any other way than through the language of economic growth and what that meant. But this is just so palpably inadequate now to the moment in which we are. And I think enough people have some instinctive, at least, understanding of that, and that the change involves them as well. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that most of them like it, and I think it terrifies many people in lots of ways. But it doesn't change the fact, I think, that social space is, and the way society is not as it was, and in that come possibilities, in that come a way of trying to face more truthfully and perhaps with less fear the questions that we're all struggling with on these issues.
Thank you very much. We have 20 minutes to go. I think that if Riccardo Rovelli is in agreement with me, we might want to ask the public in Forlì if they have any questions or comments to make.
Turn on also my video here. Okay. Well, thank you, Beda. Is there any body here in the room that would like to ask questions? Well, here we have, and actually it's the two organizers. First it will be Niko and then myself. So Niko, is that okay with you, Beda, if we proceed this way?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you need me, just raise your hand.
Okay.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for the panel, for this really excellent discussion. I really liked it. I have many questions, but I guess I need to pick one. So I guess I'm going to try and focus a little bit on the sort of politics and on the European Union. So the point was made importantly by Daniel that we need to think about the correct counterfactual when we assess the sort of costs and benefits of policies. And earlier today, Lynn Barrage pointed out that the correct counterfactual is not a business as usual without climate change, but we need to understand that actually climate change will come with its own damages, and if we want to avoid those, those are not cost-free. And I think Mr. Petruccione also mentioned that. However, European climate policies will only limit climate change if they occur at the same time with climate policies in places like China and the US and other major economies in the world. So in a way, the EU cannot limit climate change by its own policies, but can the EU somehow condition its policies to motivate also policies elsewhere in the world? And maybe just a slightly larger question, particularly with the current war going on, are we now into a new era of sort of nasty geopolitics, and what does that do to our ability to provide global public goods? Thank you. So in principle, I guess I would like to hear from any one of you what you think about that.
Maybe I would ask Daniel Gross to answer this question first, and then the others can follow up, unless you have other choices.
Well, that's a complicated question. Our, let's say, the system's ability to foster global common goods is very limited, especially since different countries have very different ideas what are the priorities in terms of common global goods. Here in Europe, it seems that climate change is among the #1 priorities. In India, it's already very different, not to speak of sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps. So I have the impression that many people here in Europe will say, okay, we need to foster the global common good of combating climate change. Then they have something very different in mind than many Indians, Africans, or others. We should be very careful when we assume instinctively that what we in Europe consider as consensus on climate change is very much represents European, or let's say, the priorities of very well-off societies. And realistically speaking, there's very little the European Union can do to bring other countries, quote unquote, to see the light. I think the strongest argument for other countries also to take climate change seriously and do something is the evidence which Mauro, I think, already partially mentioned, that the cost for them would also be very high. But I don't think we should have any illusion that other countries at a much lower level of development will be soon ready to share our priorities.
May I?
Please.
And first of all, Daniel, you're right. Both in saying that we should be wary of being excessively Eurocentric, and that one of the key motivation for other countries to adopt similar goals is a growing awareness of how much more they're going to be affected by climate change. But I'm afraid that it is a partial view. By the same, we should not assume that because other countries have a different system or are less developed, or have government who are much less responsive to public opinion than the Western democracies are, that the people in those countries feel any less strongly about climate change. Or that the 190 country representatives who were in Glasgow in November last year are all belong to other two-toned or represent a minority of activists within their government. First of all, the great majority of countries in the world, not the very majority of the population, not the majority of the landmass, but the majority of countries, a large number of them are at serious danger of disappearing altogether. And the level of tragedy that implies is something Europeans do not understand. I have to refrain, and I usually do, from speaking about the moral aspect of the European position, but it should not be forgotten. It's there. Secondly, the key question for most of these countries is the same we're asking ourselves. Can it be made to work without falling into poverty? Is stopping climate change an agenda to impoverish the society to a level that does less damage, so we can all live, perhaps not happily, but live more safely, but more poorly? And that agenda isn't acceptable anywhere else more than it's acceptable in Europe. So the biggest value of European action is to show, can you develop and can you maintain and transform a highly developed economy and society, and yet be prosperous, and yet be economically sound and be economically competitive? If we don't do it, if we can't do it, if it doesn't work, then we are all literally cooked. Our choice is boiled or burned. This is not an exaggeration. Ask the people who find themselves caught by fires and floods. So the fundamental international objective of the European Union has moved from giving the moral example and inciting others to follow it, to trying to build the working model of a decarbonized, modern, competitive, technologically advanced society. That is, the jury's out, of course. But if we manage, I think we have a powerful example. The biggest question is, can we manage in time? Because it is fair to say that a number of other countries are not following with the same speed. And it is also the impact of this energy crisis and the concern about the war, and the concern about the war spreading beyond Eastern Europe or the Eastern European flank, are not having the same reaction that we're having in Europe. There's much even greater uncertainty, and there's a greater tendency to think maybe, you know, this can be put on the back burner because it's something more urgent. That is a danger. It's a real source of preoccupation. But if you look at the results of COP26 in Glasgow, and if you were at the last plenary, where China didn't quite stop, but seriously diminished the commitment to phase out coal, you should have heard and felt the anger, the raw anger of 190 delegates towards China, because they weren't prepared to commit to phase out coal, and because they are the major emitter in the world. So I've never seen in an entire career spent in foreign relations, developing countries being angry at China in public. Yes, we are alone. We're not going to do much to the stopping climate change, but we can offer not only a moral example, but a practical one, and we can offer a common development agenda. If you look at what we are now putting on the table in terms of replacing importing fossil power from Russia with replacing from importing green power from North Africa, and if we don't make the mistake of doing this in a neo-colonial spirit, subsidize and support investment for re-export to Europe, but also for powering the local economy. You can also see the implication for the migration agenda. You can see the implication for the security and the stability of the Mediterranean region, just to give an example. I mean, I could go on. We have a gigantic agenda in that respect, but I'll stop here.
Yeah, I'll say something about the geopolitics. I mean, I think that we have entered I'll go put this differently. I think a geopolitical shock has occurred. I think, I think there's always geopolitics. I don't think there's ever an age when there isn't. And I think that the language of globalization was very unhelpful in obscuring that. I think what was true about the 2010s was that there was significant direct geopolitical competition among the big powers, and I mean by that US, China and Russia, that it took different forms. The competition between the US and China wasn't the same as that between the US and Russia, which was primarily about energy. What was interesting in the first part of the decade, while Obama was still president, was that Obama thought that climate change could be compartmentalized out of that growing geopolitical rivalry with China. And you can see that, I think, in the agreement that he stuck with China as the year before the Paris Accord. Obviously, that was derailed during the Trump presidency, but we can see, I think, in Biden's handling of the matter that the attempt to go back to that will compartmentalize climate change out didn't really work. And didn't really work because the green energy transition itself will be a site of geopolitical contest, not just involving the EU, but involving China and the US too. I think what's happened now is that a geopolitical shock, a profound one, has occurred that we can't begin to understand what the consequences of are yet, particularly perhaps where China's concerned, because Russia's made a strategic blunder, and the ways in which the United States and the EU responded, particularly the sanctions on the Russian central bank, have been a shock, I think, to China too, of understanding their vulnerability. And what do they then do about their relationship with Russia? What do they do about the energy aspects of their relationship with Russia? Do they take it as an opportunity to try to improve medium-term fossil fuel energy security by deepening that energy relationship with Russia? Or do they think that actually they need to speed up on the energy transition as far as possible, because Russia is now a significant vulnerability for them, including the ability of the US in particular to sanction them financially in a manner that's comparable to what's been happened to Russia. So what China now decides to do about energy seems to me to be a very open question. And I think what we could see there, if we go back to the autumn, so before the geopolitical shock itself occurred, is that China was running a everything at the same time energy strategy, that it didn't compartmentalize. It wanted a gas strategy, a coal strategy, an oil strategy, a climate change strategy, an electric vehicle strategy, etc. And it tried to think about them as, in some sense, all represent. Try to think about them whole. Let's put it that way. But I think China's choices have now become a lot harder, and what China is now going to do, what its priorities are going to be for the next few years as opposed to the long term, I think it is too soon to tell, and that makes it quite hard to see quite where the fallout of this geopolitical shock that's happened lands.
Great, thank you.
May I ask a question now?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I was going to give you the floor.
I'm sorry that I'm again going to concentrate mostly on Daniel, but in a sense he has been the most provocative speaker, and I would like to sort of ask him around his previous statements. The first thing I was a little bit surprised by, you quoted these numbers showing that the net investment needs for the transport transition are substantially lower than estimated by the European Commission. Earlier this morning I quoted a paper by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and he collected estimates at the world level from I think 6 or 7 different organizations that go from the International Energy Agency, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, and others. And the average investment requirement at the world level that these organizations estimate is on the order of an increase in investment from 2 to 4.5 trillion dollars a year over the next decade at the world level. So $4 trillion, which sort of seems more close to the European Commission estimate for Europe than yours estimate. Now, possibly also these organizations are doing the same mistake of confusing net and gross flows, but it would be interesting to recompute these figures also at the world level. Second, on the same issue, fiscal expenditure are not only for investments. In fact, actually, some of that investment could also be private investment. Fiscal expenditures are also for the other costs are induced by the climate deterioration, simply to mitigate the adverse effects of them, to help workers reskill, help regions respecialize. And so this is also a considerable amount of fiscal sort of incentives that should be put in. And third, in a sense more decisive, I think, let's even assume for the sake of paradox that the net investment required is zero. But then there is a huge question of a switch from the current composition of investment to the new investment required for the green transition. Because, as Mauro Petriccione reminded us, if we don't do that switch, then we will be heading for 2.9 degrees increase by in a few years, and that will cost on the order of 10-15% of world GDP net loss. So we have to do the switch. So it is not correct to imply that only net values mean, also the composition of investments, or the gross investment has important matters. And we know that markets alone will not do it, because here we have really to change the path of development. So there is an enormous issue of switching from one composition of investment and expenditures to another one. And that has, since it involves so many externalities and elements of public goods and of common goods, that of course involves a huge role for government. So what is your response to that? How do you think, don't you think that government and the European institutions should be extremely concerned and proactive in this direction?
I did not say that governments have no role. You had, I think, a large part of today discussing carbon taxes and other things, which all implied basically that we have an externality here, and it has somehow to be taken into account. Carbon taxes are theoretically the best way to do it, but there could be other ways. Subsidies for isolating homes and these things. So I was not at all trying to suggest that all of that is not, that the role of the government is not important. I took it as given that you will need government intervention to make the switch both on the supply and the demand side. That's why I showed these two things separately, right? You have the investment needed to produce more electrical power. And that means basically photovoltaics plus wind plus some battery plus some backup, which even the official estimates say that it is really modest, right? And then you have something on the demand side, which is basically insulation of homes and cars. And I wanted to point out that for transport, which mainly cars, that is hugely overestimated. Now, again, I did not mean to say that governments have no role or little role. Certainly not that the EU has no role, because this is all EU policy, right? The carbon, the ETS system which we have is a very efficient EU policy. Again, it's not perfect, right? But it is, I think, a step into the very right direction. So my point remains. There's no need to say we need special fiscal rules to facilitate governments to adjust to spend hundreds of billions to encourage the green transition. That can happen without major expenditure, especially if you have a system of carbon taxes, which we have partially in the EU. The role of government remains central. The role of the EU remains central. But I mean, you discussed it earlier. Rick van der Broek and others said that you have carbon taxes, you have subsidies, right? Wherever you pan out, that is then a question of the political economy equilibrium. If the policies set the right parameters over the medium term, then I think the market forces will then redirect the investment over time. Remember, this is not from today to tomorrow, but let's say over the next 10 years. And while the transition is very important, we have to remember that energy is less than 5% of our GDP, so it's a small but important sector which can take place over the time period which we have. And finally, we should recognize that something has already been done. Not enough, I think, as Guntram also pointed out. The speed has to accelerate. But what has been done in terms of deploying renewables, for example, so far has not led to a noticeable increase in costs, right? It was, or in fiscal costs, certainly. So that's why I come back. You don't have to have the message, look guys, we have to have higher fiscal deficits to finance the green transition. That message is not needed. I know that you said it will pay off anyway because the cost of not doing so will be very high. That argument I accept, but my proposition would be that you don't even need that argument. You should just say, if we look carefully, what we need is not trillions of new investment, but trillions of different investment. And if we set the instruments right, then the market will do it. That would be my, of course, the instrument have to be set by government, national, EU, in Europe, and then globally by different governments. And we have talked earlier right now about the difficulties of getting other governments to provide their own systems with the necessary incentives.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we are right smack at 6 o'clock in continental Europe, 5 o'clock in Cambridge. And I think I'm done. I will leave Professor Rovelli to wrap up the seminar. From my point of view, I would add something to the discussion of this afternoon. If war expands and goes beyond Ukraine, many of the things that we have discussed today might have to change. This is not, for the time being, maybe the most likely scenario, but it is something that is in people's minds. So, and this is clearly something that I'm thinking about, whether an expansion of the conflict is possible and what impact it might have on policies across Europe, including the climate policy. But this is the conclusion that I would like to mention at the end of this roundtable. And I will leave the floor to Professor Rovelli and thank the speakers from my side here in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Beda. I don't think really I am in a, especially after these last words that you said, which will of course send us thinking, but we hope it's just a pure abstract hypothesis that you made. But after that, I would not go back to number crunching or other economist discussion, unless Niko wants to add something.
I think I very much agree with Riccardo, and I think we're unfortunately in a situation where probably all of us are talking about exactly that contingency, so let's just hope it doesn't come to pass. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody. I think, Beda, you conducted excellently, an excellent panel. Very, very much thank you to Helen Thompson, Daniel Gross, and Mauro Petriccione. We really appreciated your contribution, and it was a great pleasure to have you and to listen to you, and we look forward to other opportunities to interact. And thanks for everybody else who has been listening from presence and mostly from outside, from online, to this workshop. Thank you again, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
And of course, thank you for all the people that have made this event possible, including Roberto here in the video services, and Monica and the others. Thank you a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thanks, Beda.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Ellen. Bye-bye, Mauro. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Luke. Okay. Quando termino riunione per tutti, parte la registrazione, viene archiviata. Faccio? Sì, ok.